The fluorescent lights of Denver Phi, a hospital, cast their sterile glow across operating room 3 at 2:17 in the morning. Dr. Catherine Hayes stood motionless above the table, her gloved hands hovering over the exposed chest cavity of a 23-year-old former Marine who had decided tonight that living with his memories was no longer worth the fight. The bullet had entered through the roof of his mouth, angled upward, and by some cruel mathematics of trajectory and bone density, had lodged itself against his cervical spine without killing him. Not yet, anyway. The anesthesiologist's monitor beeped its steady rhythm, oxygen saturation holding at 92%, blood pressure dropping but stable. The young man, whose dog tags read Corporal James Chen, Afghanistan 2021, still had a chance. Catherine's surgical team waited for her next move, but she remained perfectly still, studying the field before her with the same focused intensity she had once used to study distant targets through a high-powered scope. Her hands did not shake. They never shook. Not during surgery, not during the worst traumas that rolled through these doors at 3 in the morning, covered in blood and regret. Her hands had learned stillness in a different life, on rooftops in Fallujah and hilltops in the Helmand province, where the slightest tremor meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She made the first incision with the precision of someone who understood that millimeters mattered. The scalpel moved with the same calculated certainty that had once guided her finger on a trigger 2,000 yards from her target. Blood welled up, was suctioned away, and she worked deeper, following the bullet's path like tracking spoor through hostile terrain. 90 minutes later, Corporal Chen was stable, the bullet removed, his chances of walking again still uncertain, but his chances of seeing morning now approaching certainty. Catherine stripped off her gloves and surgical gown in the scrub room, her reflection in the mirror showing a woman of 42 who looked both younger and infinitely older, depending on the light. Auburn hair pulled back tight, gray eyes that rarely smiled anymore, and hands that never trembled. Dr. Michael Brennan found her in the surgeon's lounge 20 minutes later, nursing her third coffee of the shift. He was 55, director of the surgical department, former Navy corpsman who had seen his share of combat in the First Gulf War. He understood the ghosts that followed people home from places with names like Fallujah and Kandahar. "Nice work on the Chen case," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "When I saw the CT scan, I thought we'd lost him before he got to the table." Catherine took a slow sip of her coffee. "He's young, strong. He'll fight." The police report said it was self-inflicted. "I know." Brennan was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "That makes 5 this month. 5 vets under 30 who decided they couldn't carry it anymore." "I know," Catherine repeated, softer this time. "You can't save them all, Kat. I know that too." She set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "But I can save the ones who make it to my table." Brennan nodded slowly. He had known Catherine Hayes for 3 years now, since she had joined the VA hospital after completing her surgical residency at Johns Hopkins. He knew she had been a Marine before medical school, knew she had served in Iraq, knew there were parts of her service record that remained classified. He knew enough not to ask about the shadows that sometimes crossed her face when the trauma bay got too loud, too chaotic, too much like whatever she had lived through before she traded her rifle for a scalpel. What he did not know, what nobody in this hospital knew, was that Dr. Catherine Hayes had once been Staff Sergeant Catherine Morrison, Marine Scout Sniper, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, that she had 63 confirmed kills across 4 deployments, that she held the Marine Corps record for longest confirmed kill at 2,430 meters, that she had been recommended for the Navy Cross for actions during the Second Battle of Fallujah in November 2004, a recommendation that was later quietly withdrawn for reasons that remain sealed in a classified after-action report. The shift ended at 7. Catherine drove home through Denver's morning traffic in her aging Honda Civic, a vehicle so unremarkable that it suited her perfectly. She lived in a modest apartment in Capitol Hill, 3rd floor of a converted brownstone, the kind of place where neighbors nodded politely but never asked questions. The walls were mostly bare except for 2 photographs. One showed a young Marine in dress blues, Master Gunnery Sergeant James Morrison, her father, who had died in the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, trying to pull people from the wreckage. The other photograph showed a different Marine, this one in combat utilities with captain's bars, standing in front of a Humvee somewhere in Afghanistan. Captain David Morrison, her husband, killed in action in Kandahar province in 2011 when he threw himself on a Taliban grenade to save 4 Marines under his command. Catherine stood in front of that second photograph for a long moment, as she did most mornings after her shifts. David smiled out at her from across the years, frozen at 32, forever young while she grew older. "Hey," she whispered to the photograph, the same words she whispered every morning. Not a prayer exactly, but not a prayer either. An acknowledgement, a ritual, a way of making sure she remembered that she was still connected to something beyond the sterile efficiency of the operating room. She slept for 4 hours, the dreamless sleep of exhaustion, and woke to her phone buzzing on the nightstand. The screen showed a video call from West Point. She answered it immediately. Her son's face filled the screen. Jack Morrison was 19, a first-year cadet at the United States Military Academy, and he had his father's smile in his grandfather's eyes. He wore his gray cadet uniform with the same pride that 3 generations of Morrisons had worn the uniform before him. "Hey, Mom," he said, and there was excitement in his voice that made him sound younger than 19. "Guess what we're doing next month?" Catherine sat up, running a hand through her hair. "Tell me." "Advanced marksmanship training. They're bringing in guest instructors from the Marine Scout Sniper program." He leaned closer to the camera, his voice dropping as if sharing a secret. "Mom, do you think Grandpa James was good at this stuff? You never really talk about it." Catherine felt something tighten in her chest. "Your grandfather was one of the best. He could shoot and he could teach. That's a rare combination." "Did he teach you?" The question hung in the air between them. Catherine had been so careful over the years, so precise in what she revealed and what she kept hidden. Jack knew his mother had been a Marine. He knew she had deployed to Iraq, but he did not know the specifics, did not know about the rooftops and the wind calculations, and the stillness required to hold a crosshair steady on a target's center mass while accounting for Coriolis effect and humidity and a dozen other variables. "He taught me some things," Catherine said carefully. "Focus, discipline, patience, the important things." "I'm nervous about it," Jack admitted. "Everyone else in my company, their dads taught them to shoot, took them hunting. I never did any of that." "You'll do fine. You're a Morrison. It's in your blood." They talked for another 10 minutes about classes and drill formations and the upcoming Army-Navy game. When Jack signed off, promising to call again next week, Catherine sat in the silence of her apartment and felt the weight of all the things she had never told her son, about what it felt like to watch a human being through a scope at 1,500 meters and make the decision to stop their existence, about the silence that came after the shot, before the spotter confirmed the kill, about the way that silence felt like a door closing somewhere in your soul, a door you could never quite open again. The envelope arrived 3 days later. Catherine found it when she checked her mailbox after another overnight shift. Plain manila, no return address, her name and apartment number typed on a label. Inside was a single piece of paper, expensive cardstock with embossed lettering. "You are cordially invited to the first annual Rocky Mountain Veterans Precision Shooting Memorial, November 10th to 11th, hosted by the Rocky Mountain Veterans Shooting Foundation. This event honors the service and sacrifice of American snipers and designated marksmen who served with distinction. As a distinguished veteran of Marine Corps Scout sniper operations, your presence would honor us." It was signed by Colonel Vincent Hartwell, United States Marine Corps, retired. Catherine stood in her kitchen holding the invitation, and for the first time in years, her hands trembled. Not much, just a flutter, but enough that she noticed. Vincent Hartwell. She had not heard that name in person for almost 20 years, though she thought of him often. He had been her instructor at Scout Sniper Basic School in 2000, a legend in the Marine Corps sniper community, a man who had trained more successful snipers than anyone else in the Corps' history. He had been tough, demanding, and utterly without mercy for weakness. He had also been the closest thing to a father figure Catherine had known after her own father died. She almost threw the invitation away. Almost, but something made her turn it over, and that was when she saw the photograph. It was paper-clipped to the back of the invitation. A faded color photo from 2004 showing 6 Marines in combat utilities, faces streaked with dirt and sweat, standing in front of a bullet-scarred building in Fallujah. Catherine recognized herself immediately, 22 years old, 70 pounds of gear on her narrow frame, holding her M40A3 rifle with the casual competence of someone who had been carrying it through combat for 6 months. Next to her stood Corporal Raymond Blackwood, her spotter, a stocky kid from Detroit with a quick smile and quicker hands on the spotting scope. The other four faces in the photograph belonged to Corporal Jake Stevens, PFC Marcus Lee, Lance Corporal David Chen, Armors Front of Fame, Gaipa Manen, and Sergeant First Class Thomas Rodriguez. Her team. Her family for those brutal months of urban warfare in what the Marines called Operation Phantom Fury and what the rest of the world called the Second Battle of Fallujah. Three of those faces had red circles drawn around them in what looked like dried blood. Jake Stevens, Marcus Lee, David Chen, all killed in action, November 10th, 2004, during the mission that ended Catherine's combat career even though she walked away physically whole. Someone had written on the back of the photograph in block letters, "It's time to settle the ledger." Fallujah 2004. Catherine set the photograph on her kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. The faces looked back at her, young and confident and utterly unaware that three of them had less than a week to live when the picture was taken. She picked up her phone, pulled up the number for Rocky Mountain Veterans Shooting Foundation, and listened to it ring 4 times before an answering machine picked up. "You've reached Rocky Mountain Veterans Shooting Foundation. We're closed right now, but if you'd like to leave a message..." Catherine hung up. She looked at the invitation again, at the date, November 10th, 20 years to the day since Fallujah. Since the mission that killed 3 of her Marines and left Raymond Blackwood in a VA hospital in Germany with his left leg amputated below the knee. Since the day Catherine Morrison chose to follow orders instead of saving her brothers. She made the decision quickly, the way she had been trained to make all important decisions. Clear mind, clear conscience, clear action. She would go to Colorado. She would face whatever this was. She would settle the ledger if that was what was required. But she would go quietly, anonymously, just another veteran paying respects at a memorial shoot. She would not announce herself. She would not draw attention. She would watch and listen and try to understand who had sent that photograph and why they wanted her there. Catherine called the hospital and requested a week of personal time. Dr. Brennan approved it immediately. She had not taken a vacation in 2 years. She packed a small duffel bag with practical clothes, threw in a jacket for the Colorado cold, and hesitated before adding one more item from the back of her closet. A hard-sided rifle case containing her grandfather's Winchester Model 70, a gift from her father on her 16th birthday, the rifle that had first taught her that shooting was not about strength, but about stillness. The drive from Denver to Rocky Mountain took 2 hours through increasingly rural Colorado, the landscape transforming from suburban sprawl to genuine mountain country, pine trees and granite peaks in air so clear it hurt to breathe. The Rocky Mountain Veterans Shooting Foundation occupied 20 acres on the eastern slope of the Rockies, a collection of ranges extending from 100 yards out to 1,500, with a small lodge building that served as registration and meeting space. Catherine arrived at 4 p.m. on November 9th, the day before the memorial shoot officially began. The parking lot held maybe a dozen vehicles, mostly pickup trucks with veteran plates and gun rights bumper stickers. She sat in her Honda for a few minutes, watching people move in and out of the lodge, trying to identify them by their bearing and movement. All military, she decided. All men except for one woman in her 40s who moved like someone who had carried a heavy pack for many miles. When Catherine finally stepped out of her car, she had transformed herself. Hair down instead of pulled back, civilian clothes carefully chosen to suggest someone who was not entirely comfortable in them, movements deliberately softened to hide the efficient precision that marked her as someone with serious training. She became Dr. Kate Brennan, using her director's last name, a trauma surgeon from Denver who had grown curious about shooting after treating too many gunshot wounds. The lodge interior was all exposed timber and stone fireplace, with a long registration desk where a young man in his 30s sat reading a copy of Precision Shooter magazine. He looked up when Catherine entered and offered a professional smile. "Welcome to Rocky Mountain. You here for the memorial shoot?" "I am. Is there still space?" "Plenty. Name?" "Kate Brennan." He checked his computer, not finding it, which was expected. Catherine had not pre-registered. "No problem. We take walk-ins. Just need to see your ID and have you fill out the waiver." While Catherine filled out the paperwork, she listened to the conversations happening around the lodge. A group of 4 men in their 50s and 60s stood near the fireplace, and from their easy camaraderie and shared vocabulary, she identified them as Marine Scout snipers, probably from different eras but bonded by the shared experience of the craft. Another cluster of men, younger, talked about Afghanistan and the particular challenges of mountain warfare at altitude. No one paid her any attention. Good. You have your own rifle? The registration clerk asked. I do. Winchester Model 70, 308. Nice. Classic. You'll be shooting in the historical division then. What's your experience level? Catherine had prepared for this question. Recreational. My father taught me the basics, but I've never done competitive shooting. Well, you picked a good event to start. Tomorrow's the actual memorial ceremony and the main competition, but tonight's just informal practice if you want to zero your rifle and get comfortable with the ranges. I'd like that. He handed her a range map and a badge that said Competitor 47. Ranges are open until dark. Just check in with the range officer on duty. Have fun. Catherine took her rifle case from the car and walked toward the ranges. The facility was impressive, clearly built, and maintained by people who understood precision shooting. The shorter ranges had covered firing positions with benches and sandbags. The longer ranges extended up the mountain slope, with steel targets visible at various distances marked by range flags. She found the 300-yard range and was pleased to see it was empty. The range officer, a man in his 70s with weathered skin and sharp eyes, watched her set up with the careful attention of someone who had been teaching shooters for decades. First time here, he asked? Yes, sir. Where'd you serve? The question caught her off guard. She had been careful not to project military bearing, but apparently not careful enough for this old man's practiced eye. Iraq, she said, which was true. Medical Corps, she added, which was not. He nodded, satisfied. Good on you. We need more docs who understand what it's like downrange. You need help setting up? I think I'm okay, thank you. Catherine assembled her rifle with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times, trying to make her movements look less smooth than they were. The Winchester felt good in her hands, familiar and solid. She had not fired it in 3 years, not since the last time she had gone to a civilian range and found that the smell of gunpowder and the crack of rifles brought back too many memories she was trying to leave behind. She loaded 5 rounds into the magazine, worked the bolt, and settled into a prone position behind the rifle. Through the scope, the 300-yard target looked close enough to touch. She took a breath, let half of it out, found the stillness at the bottom of her breath, and pressed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The target remained unchanged, no impact visible. Catherine worked the bolt, chambered another round, and fired again. Another miss. The range officer walked over, concerned. You okay? Want me to check your scope mounting? No, Catherine forced frustration into her voice. I thought I had this zeroed. Maybe the drive jostled something. He helped her adjust the scope, and she fired 3 more rounds, each one carefully placed to suggest someone who was trying hard but lacked fundamental skills. One hit the target low and left. One hit just outside the 9 ring. One missed completely. Well, the range officer said charitably, at least you're consistent in your inconsistency. Want to try a closer target? 200 yards? Maybe I should. I clearly need more practice than I thought. She spent the next hour deliberately shooting poorly at various distances, establishing herself as an enthusiastic amateur. It felt strange, almost physically painful, to shoot badly on purpose. Every instinct in her body wanted to put rounds through the exact center of the target, to demonstrate the skills she had spent 20 years developing. But she forced herself to miss, to struggle, to look like someone who meant well, but lacked the fundamental understanding of ballistics and body mechanics that separated casual shooters from true marksmen. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ranges, other shooters started to arrive. Catherine packed up her rifle and walked back toward the lodge, where she could hear voices and smell something cooking. The memorial dinner, according to the schedule, would be served at 6. She was almost to the lodge when she saw him. Colonel Vincent Hartwell stood on the lodge's front deck, silhouetted against the warm light spilling from inside. He was older than Catherine remembered, his hair completely silver now, his frame thinner, but he carried himself with the same erect posture that had intimidated her 24 years ago at Scout Sniper School. He was talking to a younger man, pointing at something in the distance, and even from 50 yards away, Catherine could hear the authority in his voice. She stopped walking, suddenly uncertain. Should she approach him, announce herself, or continue her anonymous observer routine? Before she could decide, another figure emerged from the lodge, and Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Raymond Blackwood rolled his wheelchair down the deck ramp with the practiced ease of someone who had been using one for 20 years. He had aged too, his Detroit street kid swagger now tempered by pain and time, but Catherine would have recognized him anywhere. The same broad shoulders, the same careful eyes that had once spotted targets for her across the rooftops of Fallujah. Ray wore his Marine Corps jacket, the one with the Scout sniper insignia on the shoulder and the Purple Heart ribbon on the chest. He rolled up next to Colonel Hartwell, and the two men stood talking while Catherine watched from the shadows. She should go to them, should announce herself, but something held her back. The photograph with the red circles, the message about settling the ledger. This was not a friendly reunion. This was something else. Catherine retreated to her car and sat in the darkness, watching the lodge. More veterans arrived for the dinner, most of them men in their 50s and 60s, all of them moving with a distinctive bearing of people who had spent time in uniform. Through the lodge windows, she could see them gathering around tables, sharing stories and beer, and the easy camaraderie of people who had survived things that civilians could not understand. She could not go in there, not yet. Not until she understood what was really happening. Catherine started her car and drove into the small town 5 miles from the range, found a motel that took cash and did not ask questions, and checked in under her Kate Brennan alias. The room was clean and cheap and utterly forgettable. She lay on the bed fully clothed and tried not to think about Fallujah, about the mission, about the choice she had made. But of course she thought about it. She had thought about it every day for 20 years. November 10th, 2004, Second Battle of Fallujah. Her team had been assigned to overwatch duty for a supply convoy moving through the city's western corridor. 6 Marines in a 4-story building with good sight lines and clear fields of fire. Catherine on the rifle, Ray on the spotting scope, 4 Marines pulling security on the lower floors. The convoy had been 12 Humvees carrying ammunition and medical supplies to the Marines fighting in the city's interior. High value, high priority, absolutely critical. At 14:35 hours, the insurgents had sprung their ambush. RPGs from 3 directions, small arms fire from prepared positions, a coordinated attack designed to destroy the convoy and kill every American in it. Catherine had gone to work immediately, methodical and precise. 12 shots, 8 kills, suppressing fire positions and eliminating the RPG teams. The convoy was taking fire but holding formation, and with Catherine's support, it looked like they would make it through. Then at 14:51 hours, the insurgents had attacked her building. Catherine still remembered Ray's voice over the radio, calm despite the circumstances. "We've got company. Ground floor is breached. They're coming up." The 4 Marines on security had engaged, and Catherine could hear the firefight below her. Close quarters case, grenades and automatic weapons in the stairwell. Then Ray's voice again, more urgent now. "Cat, they're overrunning us. Chen and Rodriguez are down. We need to fall back." And then the voice she had been dreading, the voice that still echoed in her nightmares. Captain Bryce Morrison, her commanding officer on the command net. "Overwatch 2, this is actual. Maintain your position. The convoy is still in the kill zone. You are their only cover. Acknowledge." Catherine had looked through her scope at the convoy, still taking fire, still vulnerable. Then she had looked at the stairwell door, where she could hear Ray and the others fighting for their lives against overwhelming numbers. The choice had taken exactly 8 seconds. Overwatch 2 acknowledges, maintaining position. She had kept shooting, kept covering the convoy, kept doing her job while Ray and the others fought alone below her. The convoy had made it through. 47 Marines had survived because Catherine Hayes had stayed at her post and done what she was ordered to do. But when the quick reaction force had finally arrived and secured the building, they had found Corporal Jake Stevens dead from multiple gunshot wounds in the second-floor hallway. They had found PFC Marcus Lee dead in the stairwell, his body sprawled across a grenade he had jumped on to protect the others. They had found Lance Corporal David Chen alive, but bleeding out from a femoral artery hit, and he had died in the helicopter before reaching the field hospital. They had found Sergeant Rodriguez critically wounded but stable. They had found Raymond Blackwood with his left leg mangled beyond repair, bone and tissue destroyed by an insurgent's grenade. And they had found Staff Sergeant Catherine Morrison on the rooftop, still in her hide position, still covering the convoy's exit route, her face wet with tears, but her hands absolutely steady on her rifle. The investigation had been quick and conclusive. Staff Sergeant Morrison had followed orders. She had maintained her position as commanded. She had saved the convoy. The loss of 3 Marines and the critical wounding of 2 others was tragic but unavoidable given the circumstances. She had been recommended for the Navy Cross. The recommendation had been withdrawn 2 weeks later after Raymond Blackwood, from his hospital bed in Germany, had filed a formal complaint alleging that Catherine Morrison had abandoned her team in violation of the fundamental Marine Corps principle that you never leave a Marine behind. The complaint had gone nowhere officially. Catherine's orders had been clear. She had followed them. Case closed. But Raymond Blackwood had made sure everyone knew his version of events. That Catherine Morrison had chosen the lives of strangers over the lives of her brothers. That she had listened to 3 Marines die over the radio rather than disobey an order. That she was a coward hiding behind regulations and rank. Catherine had submitted her resignation from the Marine Corps 3 months later. Not because of the accusations, but because she could not argue with them. Raymond Blackwood was right. She had made a choice. She had valued obedience over loyalty. She had let 3 men die because a captain had ordered her to maintain her position. The Navy Cross recommendation had been formally withdrawn. Catherine had accepted a general discharge under honorable conditions. She had used her GI Bill to attend medical school because she had decided that if she was going to live with the guilt of those deaths, she would at least spend the rest of her life saving other people. But she had never forgotten, and apparently Raymond Blackwood had not forgotten either. Catherine did not sleep that night in the motel. She lay in the darkness and listened to the mountain wind against the windows and thought about the ledger that someone wanted to settle. She thought about Jake Stevens, who had been 20 years old and planning to marry his high school sweetheart when he got home. She thought about Marcus Lee, who had wanted to be a teacher, who had jumped on a grenade to save his brothers. She thought about David Chen, who had bled out in a helicopter because Catherine had not been there to apply pressure to his femoral artery. She thought about what she owed them, what she owed Raymond Blackwood, what she owed the truth. At 5 in the morning, she made her decision. She would go to the memorial shoot. She would face Raymond Blackwood. She would let him say whatever he needed to say. And if settling the ledger meant confessing publicly that she had failed her Marines, then that was what she would do. Because Dr. Catherine Hayes had saved hundreds of lives in operating rooms across 3 years. But Staff Sergeant Catherine Morrison had let 3 Marines die in a stairwell in Fallujah. And no amount of surgical precision could ever balance that equation. She drove back to the Rocky Mountain Veteran Shooting Foundation as the sun rose over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that reminded her too much of muzzle flash and tracer fire. The parking lot was already filling with vehicles, and she could see veterans gathered on the lodge deck, drinking coffee and talking in the easy morning voices of men who had survived their wars and found peace on the other side. Catherine parked her Honda and sat for a moment, gathering herself. Then she saw the television van pulling into the lot, a local news crew setting up cameras to cover the memorial event. This was bigger than she had anticipated. More public, more witnesses to whatever reckoning was coming. She got out of her car and walked toward the lodge, carrying her rifle case, ready to face the past she had been running from for 20 years. That was when she heard the voice behind her, rough with age and cigarettes, but still carrying the unmistakable authority of command. Staff Sergeant Morrison, I was wondering when you'd show yourself. Catherine turned slowly. Colonel Vincent Hartwell stood 10 feet away, older and thinner than she remembered, but with the same steel-gray eyes that had seen through every excuse and evasion she had ever attempted at Scout Sniper School. It's Dr. Hayes now, sir, has been for a long time. I know what you call yourself. Hartwell stepped closer, studying her face with the intensity of someone reading terrain before an assault. I also know you didn't send in a registration form. You're trying to stay anonymous. Why? Catherine held up the invitation. Someone sent me this, with a photograph, a message about settling the ledger. Hartwell's expression darkened. Let me see it. She showed him the photograph, the red circles, the message on the back. The colonel examined it for a long moment, then handed it back with a shake of his head. I didn't send this. Someone's using my name, using this memorial for something else. He looked toward the lodge where Raymond Blackwood had just rolled out onto the deck in his wheelchair. Ray's been here for a week, helping organize. I thought it was strange, given your history, but he seemed genuine about honoring the fallen. Maybe he is, Catherine said quietly. Or maybe he's been planning this for 20 years. Hartwell met her eyes. What happened in Fallujah, Morrison? The real story, not the official version. I followed orders, sir. That's the real story. And 3 Marines died because of it. Yes, sir. Hartwell was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. I taught you to shoot. I taught you to think. I taught you to survive, but I never taught you the hardest lesson of all. What's that, sir? That sometimes the right choice and the lawful choice aren't the same thing, and you have to live with whichever one you make. He gestured toward the lodge. Ray's going to confront you today, in front of everyone. I can feel it. Are you ready for that? Catherine looked at the lodge, at the gathering crowd of veterans, at the cameras being set up to record the memorial ceremony. I don't know, but I'm here. That has to count for something. It does, Hartwell said. It takes more courage to face judgment than to run from it. He started to walk toward the lodge, then paused. One more thing, Morrison, when Ray makes his move, remember this. You're not the only one who's been carrying Fallujah around for 20 years. He has too, and sometimes the heaviest burdens make people do desperate things. Catherine watched her old instructor walk away, and she understood that today was not going to be about a shooting competition. It was going to be about truth and guilt and the impossible choices that war forces on people who are too young to understand that some decisions echo for decades. She walked into the lodge, and the moment she crossed the threshold, Raymond Blackwood looked up from his wheelchair and locked eyes with her across the crowded room. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ray smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. He raised his coffee cup in a mock salute, and Catherine Hayes knew that the reckoning she had been dreading for 20 years was about to begin. The lodge fell silent in the way that only happens when violence is about to break the surface of civility. Not complete silence, because the coffee maker still hissed and gurgled, and somewhere a radio played old country music at low volume, but the human silence of breath held and words swallowed, and every veteran in that room recognizing the moment before contact, before the bullet leaves the chamber, before everything changes. Raymond Blackwood set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. The sound of ceramic on wood carried across the room like a judge's gavel. He rolled his wheelchair forward 3 feet, positioning himself in the center of the lodge, where everyone could see him, where the morning light from the windows fell across his face and illuminated the scars that 20 years in hard living had carved into what had once been a young man's cocky smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried the practiced projection of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in his mind. "I want to tell you a story about honor, about duty, about what happens when someone chooses to follow orders instead of following their heart." Catherine stood near the door, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, to leave, to avoid what was coming. But she had not driven 2 hours through the mountains to run away. She had come here to face this. So she stayed, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing controlled, watching Raymond Blackwood prepare to destroy her reputation in front of 50 veterans and a television news crew. Colonel Hartwell moved to intercept, but Ray held up a hand. "Colonel, sir, with respect, I'm not breaking any rules here. Just exercising my freedom of speech. You taught us that Marines earn the right to speak their minds by serving their country. I served. I earned this." Hartwell stopped but did not retreat. His weathered face showed no emotion, but Catherine saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. The old warrior recognized a battle he could not stop, only witness. 20 years ago today," Ray continued, his voice steady and clear, "I was a corporal in the United States Marine Corps, scout sniper, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. We were in Fallujah, Iraq, fighting house to house, room to room, trying to take back that city from insurgents who would rather die than surrender. It was November 10th, 2004, the Marine Corps birthday. We joked about it that morning, said we'd celebrate after the mission with whatever food we could scrounge." He paused, and Catherine saw his jaw tighten. The memory was as fresh for him as it was for her. "Our team was 6 Marines. I was the spotter for our sniper, a staff sergeant who was one of the best shots in the Corps. We were assigned overwatch for a supply convoy, high-value target, critical mission, standard operation." Ray looked directly at Catherine now, and his eyes held 20 years of pain and anger. "We took a position in a 4-story building. Good sight lines, good fields of fire. We were doing our job." Around the room, veterans leaned forward. Some of them had been in Fallujah. Some had been in other urban battles with different names, but the same fundamental brutality. They all recognized the shape of this story before Ray told it. The convoy got ambushed. Multiple RPGs, coordinated small arms fire. It was a kill box designed to wipe out every American in those Humvees. And our sniper, she went to work. 12 shots, 8 kills. She was surgical. Perfect. The convoy started to break free. Ray's voice hardened. Then the insurgents attacked our building, came up through the ground floor like rats in a wall. We had 4 Marines on security, and they engaged, but we were outnumbered 3-1. The fighting moved up the stairwell. Grenades, small arms, close quarters, hell. Catherine felt the memories flooding back, the sound of gunfire below her position. Jake Stevens' voice on the radio, calm despite the chaos, calling out targets and positions. Marcus Lee's laugh, incongruous and brave, shouting something about the Marine Corps birthday. David Chen's grunt of pain when the first bullet found him. "We called for support," Ray said. "We called for our sniper to fall back, to help us, to remember that Marines don't abandon Marines. And you know what happened?" He let the question hang in the air. The television camera operator shifted position to get a better angle. Catherine saw Colonel Hartwell's face, and for a moment she thought she saw something that might have been sympathy, or might have been disappointment, or might have been both. She stayed at her post, because the convoy was still taking fire, because her commanding officer ordered her to maintain her position, because she chose to follow orders instead of saving her brothers. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, spreading ripples of shock and judgment. Some of the veterans shifted uncomfortably, others nodded, seeing both sides of an impossible choice. A few looked at Catherine with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. 3 Marines died in that stairwell, Ray continued, and now his voice cracked with emotion he could no longer contain. Jake Stevens, 20 years old, engaged to be married. Marcus Lee, 19, wanted to be a teacher. David Chen, 22, had a baby daughter back home he'd never met. They died fighting while our sniper stayed on her rifle, covering strangers instead of saving family. He rolled his wheelchair closer to Catherine, closing the distance between them to maybe 10 feet. And me, I took a grenade that destroyed my leg. Spent 6 months in the hospital. Another year learning to walk again with a prosthetic. 20 years dealing with phantom pain and nightmares in the knowledge that if she had just disobeyed one order, just once, maybe my brothers would still be alive. Catherine met his eyes and did not look away. She owed him that much. Owed Jake and Marcus and David that much. To stand here and accept the judgment that was coming. "So I ask all of you," Ray said, turning to address the room, "what makes a good Marine? Following orders? Or protecting your brothers? Because apparently you can't do both." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the coffee maker had stopped hissing. Somewhere outside, a crow called, harsh and lonely in the mountain air. Then Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the stillness. "You're right." Ray blinked, surprised. He had been prepared for denial, for excuses, for anger, not for agreement. "You're right," Catherine repeated, stepping forward into the center of the room. "I stayed at my post. I followed orders, and 3 Marines died because of it." She could feel every eye in the room on her now. The weight of judgment, of history, of 20 years of guilt she had carried in silence. "Captain Morrison ordered me to maintain position. He said the convoy was critical, that I was their only cover, that I had to keep shooting. So I did. I stayed on my rifle while I listened to Jake and Marcus and David die over the radio. I stayed on my rifle while you fought alone, Ray. I made a choice." Catherine's hands were steady, but her voice was not. 47 Marines in that convoy survived because I followed orders. I've thought about that number every day for 20 years. 47 people who went home to their families. 47 people who got to live because I stayed at my post. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was barely above a whisper. "But I've also thought about 3 every day. Jake, Marcus, David. 3 brothers I didn't save. 3 families I destroyed. 3 graves I'm responsible for." Ray's face showed confusion now, the script he had prepared not accounting for this response. "So you admit it. You abandoned us." "I followed my orders," Catherine said. "Whether that means I abandon you, I'll let everyone here decide." She looked around the room, meeting eyes with veterans who had faced their own impossible choices. "I became a doctor because I couldn't live with being a sniper anymore. I work at the VA hospital in Denver. I spend my nights saving Marines and soldiers and sailors who come through my doors broken and bleeding. I save every single one I can." Her voice grew stronger. "But I can't save Jake or Marcus or David. I can't give you back your leg, Ray. I can't undo the choice I made. All I can do is spend the rest of my life trying to balance the equation." Colonel Hartwell stepping forward then. his command voice filling the room. Blackwood, Morrison, that's enough. This is a memorial event, not a court-martial. But Ray shook his head. No, sir. This needs to be said. This needs to be witnessed. He looked at Catherine with an expression that was equal parts pain and rage. You want to balance the equation? Fine, I challenge you, a shooting competition. Right here, right now, in front of everyone. Ray, that's not going to solve anything, Catherine said. Maybe not, but it'll prove something. He gestured at the ranges outside. 3 stages, 300 yards, 600 yards, 1,000 yards. You win, I publicly apologize and admit that you made the right call in Fallujah. I win, you admit on camera that you were wrong, that you should have saved your team instead of following orders. The room erupted in murmurs. Some veterans objected, calling it disrespectful to turn a memorial into a competition. Others argued that it was a fair challenge, that Catherine should accept if she had nothing to hide. The television crew sensed a story developing and kept their cameras rolling. Colonel Hartwell looked at Catherine, and she could read the question in his eyes. She could refuse. She could walk away. No one would force her to accept this challenge. But Catherine thought about Jake Stevens, who had loved baseball and bad jokes and had proposed to his girlfriend via email from a combat outpost in Ramadi. She thought about Marcus Lee, who had carried pictures of his future classroom in his pack, who had talked about teaching history to inner-city kids. She thought about David Chen, whose daughter was now 22 years old and worked as a nurse in San Francisco and had never known her father's voice. She thought about what she owed them. I accept, Catherine said quietly. Ray's eyes widened. He had expected resistance, argument, maybe even Catherine backing down. Not immediate acceptance. But I have one condition, Catherine continued. Win or lose, after this is done, we talk. Really talk. Not in front of cameras, not in front of a crowd, just you and me and Colonel Hartwell. We tell the whole story, everything that happened, everything we've carried, and then we decide together how to move forward. Ray studied her face for a long moment, searching for deception or manipulation and finding only exhaustion and sincerity. Finally, he nodded. Agreed, but the competition happens first. Colonel Hartwell raised his hands for silence. All right, if this is happening, it happens properly. Official rules. Neutral range officer. We do this with honor or we don't do it at all. He turned to the assembled veterans. Anyone who wants to witness, you are welcome to observe. But this is not entertainment. This is 2 Marines trying to settle something that's been broken for 20 years. Show some respect. The crowd shifted, organizing itself. Someone suggested they use the memorial shoot format, 5 shots per stage. Total score determines the winner. Someone else volunteered to serve as official scorer. The television crew asked permission to film, and Ray surprised everyone by agreeing. Let people see, he said. Let them judge for themselves. Within 30 minutes, the competition was organized. The 300-yard range was prepared, targets set, rifles inspected. Word had spread and more veterans arrived, drawn by the drama and the opportunity to see 2 elite snipers compete. The parking lot filled with trucks and motorcycles. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mountain mist. Catherine retrieved her Winchester from her car, the same rifle she had deliberately shot poorly with the evening before. She could feel the weight of expectations settling onto her shoulders like a heavy pack. Part of her wanted to continue the act, to shoot poorly again, to give Ray his victory and the closure he seemed to need. But that would be dishonest. That would diminish what Jake and Marcus and David had died for. If she was going to do this, she would do it truthfully. She assembled her rifle with her real skill now, no longer hiding the practiced efficiency of 10,000 repetitions. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who had lived with this tool, who had trusted it with her life and the lives of others. Ray watched her from his wheelchair, and she saw recognition dawn in his eyes. He had known her as a sniper, had watched her shoot in combat, had seen the precision that made her one of the best in the Corps. He was seeing it again now. You were hiding last night, he said. It was not a question. I was observing, Catherine replied. You came here expecting a trap. I came here expecting the truth to come out. I was right. Ray almost smiled at that. Almost. Well, at least we're being honest now. The range officer called them to the line. 300 yards, 5 shots each, scored on a standard precision rifle target. Ray would shoot first as the challenger. Catherine would shoot second. The crowd gathered at a respectful distance. maybe 100 veterans now, some active duty, some retired, some as old as Colonel Hartwell, and some young enough to have served in Afghanistan's final days. They formed a rough semicircle, silent and attentive, understanding that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple shooting competition. Ray transferred from his wheelchair to a shooting mat with the practiced ease of 2 decades of adaptation. His prosthetic leg was visible below his rolled-up pant leg, the modern carbon fiber and hydraulics a far cry from the crude replacements of earlier wars. He positioned himself behind a heavy precision rifle, a custom-built .308 that had clearly been tailored to his needs. The range officer called the line hot. Ray chambered around and settled behind his scope. Catherine watched him from 15 feet away, and she remembered a different version of this man. Corporal Raymond Blackwood, 22 years old, full of swagger and street-smart humor, the best spotter she had ever worked with. He could read wind like some people read books, could judge distance by eye within 5 meters, could keep her calm during the endless hours of waiting that characterized sniper operations. They had been a team. More than that, they had been friends. And then Fallujah had broken something between them that Catherine had never figured out how to fix. Ray fired his first shot. The report echoed across the range, sharp and clean. The spotter in the tower called it. 10 ring, 11 o'clock. Professional murmurs rippled through the crowd. That was excellent shooting, especially from a prone position with a prosthetic leg that might affect stability and body mechanics. Ray fired 4 more times with methodical precision. The scores came by on 10, 10, 9, 10. 49 out of 50 possible points. He cleared his rifle and stood, rolled back from the line, his face showing satisfaction but not triumph. That was a score that would beat most competitive shooters. But Ray knew Catherine. He knew what she was capable of. "Your turn, Staff Sergeant," he said, using her old rank deliberately. Catherine moved to the line and settled into her shooting position with the kind of economical movement that separated amateurs from professionals. Every motion had a purpose. Every adjustment was minimal and precise. She became still in the way that only true marksmen can, a stillness that goes beyond the physical into something almost meditative. Through the scope, the 300-yard target looked close enough to touch. The wind was maybe 4 miles per hour from the west, barely worth accounting for at this distance. Temperature was 48 degrees, humidity low. All factors that Catherine's brain calculated and incorporated without conscious thought, the way some people can hear a song and know immediately if it's off key. She found her natural respiratory pause, that moment between breaths where the body is most stable, and pressed the trigger. The Winchester barked. The recoil pushed into her shoulder like an old familiar handshake. 10 ring, dead center, the spotter called. Catherine worked the bolt, chambered the next round, found her pause, fired. 10 ring, touching the first hole. She fired 3 more times with the same mechanical precision, and each time the spotter's call came back the same. 10 ring, center mass, group size that you could cover with a quarter. 50 out of 50 possible points. The crowd stirred, impressed despite themselves. Even among veteran snipers, that kind of shooting was rare. That kind of precision suggested not just skill, but something deeper, a fundamental understanding of ballistics and body mechanics that most people never achieved. Ray's face showed no surprise, only a grim acknowledgement. He had known this was possible, had probably expected it. "Stage 1 to Morrison," the range officer announced. 50 to 49. They moved to the 600-yard range. This was where shooting became more art than science, where wind and weather and a dozen subtle factors could turn a perfect shot into a miss. The target seemed impossibly small at that distance, barely visible even through high-powered optics. The wind had picked up, gusting to maybe 12 miles per hour from the southwest. The range officer provided wind flags every 100 yards, and Catherine watched them dance and twist, reading the patterns like a language she had once been fluent in and had never completely forgotten. Ray shot first again, taking his time, making careful adjustments for wind and elevation. His first 3 shots scored 10s. His 4th shot caught an unexpected gust and drifted to a 9. His 5th shot, overcorrected, landed at 9 again. 48 out of 50, still excellent shooting, still better than 99% of riflemen could achieve. But Catherine could see the frustration in Ray's shoulders as he cleared his rifle. He had wanted perfection, had needed it to prove his point, whatever that point was, that he was as good as her, that Fallujah had not broken him, that he deserved the answer she had never given him. Catherine took the line and immediately felt the difference in conditions. The wind was gustier now, less predictable. She would need to time her shots between gusts to find the brief windows of stability. She waited, watching the flags, feeling the wind on her face, remembering 1,000 other shots in worse conditions. Desert winds that could push a bullet 3 feet at 1,000 yards. Mountain winds that swirled and eddied in ways that made prediction impossible. Combat winds mixed with smoke and dust and the breath of explosions. This was just Colorado wind, clean and honest. She fired 5 times, pausing between shots to read the conditions, to time the gaps in the gusts. Each shot felt right leaving the barrel, that ineffable sensation when you know the bullet is going exactly where you intended. 5 tens, 50 out of 50. The crowd was no longer just impressed. They were witnessing something remarkable, the kind of shooting that becomes legend in military circles. Old snipers nudged each other, making comments about natural talent and hours of practice and the kind of focus that cannot be taught. Colonel Hartwell stood apart from the crowd, his face unreadable, but Catherine saw him nod slightly. Recognition from the man who had taught her everything she knew about precision shooting. Stage 2 to Morrison, the range officer announced, 100 to 97 cumulative. They prepared for the final stage. 1,000 yards, the distance where everything mattered, where a single degree of angle error translated to feet of miss, where wind could be gusting different directions at different points along the bullet's flight path, where the Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation became a real factor in the calculations. This was the distance that separated good snipers from great ones. This was the distance where Catherine Hayes had once held the Marine Corps record, had once put a bullet through a Taliban commander's chest at 2,430 meters, nearly 1.5 miles, a shot that had been classified and never officially confirmed, but that lived in whispered stories among scout snipers. The crowd knew it too. They had gone quiet now, not with the silence of before, but with the reverent hush of people watching history unfold. But before they could begin the final stage, before Ray could take his position, he held up a hand. "Wait," he said, "I want to change the terms." Colonel Hartwell stepped forward immediately. "Blackwood, you agreed to the rules. You can't change them now." "I'm not changing the scoring, sir. I'm changing the targets." Ray gestured to someone in the crowd, and 3 men came forward carrying what looked like oversized photographs mounted on backing boards. Catherine's stomach dropped when she saw what they were. Life-size photographs, printed on weather-resistant material and mounted on target frames. 3 faces enlarged to human proportion. Corporal Jake Stevens, smiling in his dress blues, the photo probably from his boot camp graduation. PFC Marcus Lee, candid shot, laughing at something off camera, looking impossibly young. Captain David Morrison, Catherine's husband, in his combat utilities, standing next to a Humvee in Afghanistan. "No," Colonel Hartwell said immediately. "Absolutely not. This crosses a line, Ray." But Ray ignored him, focused entirely on Catherine. "You want to prove you can still pull the trigger when it matters? Fine, pull it on them, 1 shot each. Show everyone here that you can aim at the faces of the people you failed and still shoot straight." The crowd erupted in objections. Veterans shouted that this was disrespectful, obscene, a violation of everything the memorial was supposed to represent. The television crew hesitated, uncertain if they should keep filming something that had shifted from competition to something darker. Catherine stared at the 3 photographs being mounted at the 1,000-yard line. Jake's smile, Marcus's laugh, David's steady gaze. 3 men she had loved, 3 men she had lost, 3 ghosts she had been carrying for 20 years. "This is emotional abuse," Colonel Hartwell said, stepping between Catherine and Ray. "I won't allow it." But Catherine put a hand on the colonel's shoulder. "It's all right, sir. It's not all right. This is psychological torture." "Maybe," Catherine said quietly. "But maybe it's also what I need to do. Maybe I need to face them. Really face them." She looked at Ray, and for the first time since she had arrived at Rocky Mountain, she felt something crack open inside her chest. Some wall she had built to keep the grief contained. "I'll shoot your targets, Ray. But know this, whatever happens today, it won't bring them back. It won't give you your leg back. It won't erase Fallujah. It'll just be 3 more bullets that can't undo the past." Ray's face showed something that might have been regret or might have been determination. Maybe, but at least it'll be honest. They waited while the photographs were positioned at the 1,000-yard line. The wind had shifted again, now coming from the northwest at maybe 15 miles per hour, strong enough to move the photo targets on their frames, making them seem almost alive. Catherine walked to her rifle case and started to assemble the Winchester. But Colonel Hartwell stopped her. "Use this instead," he said, pulling a weapon from his own case. A Remington 700 military grade fitted with a high-powered scope and match-grade barrel. The same model Catherine had used in combat, the same platform that had served her for 4 deployments. "Sir, I can't. It's not a gift. It's a loan, and it's the right tool for this distance." Hartwell met her eyes. "I taught you on this rifle, Catherine. Let it teach you one more time." Catherine accepted the weapon with both hands, feeling its familiar weight. This was not just a rifle. It was a connection to her past, to the Marine she had been, to the person she had tried so hard to leave behind. She carried it to the 1,000-yard line and settled into position. Through the scope, she could see Jake Stevens' face, wind rippling across the photograph, his smile seeming to flicker and change in the mountain light. The range fell silent. 100 veterans held their breath. The television camera recorded everything. Catherine put the crosshairs on Jake's face. Her finger rested on the trigger. All she had to do was breathe, find the pause, press. But her hands began to shake. For the first time in 25 years of shooting, through combat and competition and 1,000 training exercises, Catherine Hayes' hands trembled on her rifle. She could not do it, could not put a bullet through Jake Stevens' smile, even if it was just a photograph, even if it was just paper and ink and symbolism. 30 seconds passed, 60. The crowd began to murmur. Ray called out from his position, "Pull the trigger, Catherine, or admit you don't have the courage." Catherine's breath came faster, her vision blurred with tears. Through the scope, Jake's face seemed to move, to speak, to ask her why she had not saved him. She lowered the rifle, stood up, walked away from the firing line. The crowd erupted in confusion and argument. Some said she had failed the challenge. Others said Ray had gone too far. The range officer tried to restore order, but could not make himself heard over the chaos. Catherine walked past all of them, past the lodge, past the parking lot, until she reached a small outcropping of rock that overlooked the valley below. She sat down heavily, the Remington still in her hands, and finally let herself cry. She cried for Jake and Marcus and David, for Ray's shattered leg and shattered life, for her son Jack, who would never know his father, for the 47 Marines she had saved and the 3 she had not, for every impossible choice that war forces on people too young to understand that some decisions echo forever. She did not hear Colonel Hartwell approach, did not realize he was there until he sat down beside her on the rock, his old bones creaking with the effort. They sat in silence for a long time, watching an eagle circle in the thermal currents above the valley. Finally, Hartwell spoke. "I never told you about my first command in the Gulf War." Catherine wiped her eyes. "Sir, Kuwait, 1991. I was commanding a reconnaissance unit during the ground offensive. We were tasked with locating Iraqi artillery positions." He paused, and Catherine heard decades of weight in that pause. "We found one, a battery of artillery pieces positioned near a small village. High-value target. Command wanted them eliminated immediately." The colonel's hands, gnarled with arthritis and age, clenched into fists. "But when I glassed the position, I saw they had Iraqi soldiers mixed in with civilian vehicles. Families, women, children, using them as human shields. I had the coordinates. I had authorization to call in an airstrike. My commanding officer said eliminate the threat." Catherine waited, knowing what was coming, knowing why Hartwell had never told this story before. "I didn't call it in," Hartwell said quietly. "I reported that we couldn't get a clean shot without civilian casualties. I recommended we wait for a better opportunity. My CO was furious, threatened to relieve me of command." "What happened, sir?" "The artillery battery fired on our forces 2 hours later. Killed 11 Marines, wounded 30 more. They died because I couldn't call in that strike when it would have meant killing civilians." Hartwell turned to look at Catherine. His eyes were wet. "I've lived with that choice for 34 years. I've asked myself a million times if I did the right thing. And I still don't know, but I do know this. I could live with the guilt of those 11 Marines dying. I could not have lived with ordering a strike that killed innocent families." He gestured back toward the range. "What Ray's asking you to do, shooting those photographs, it's not about marksmanship. It's about making you relive the choice you made, making you hurt the way he's been hurting. But here's what he doesn't understand. You've been hurting all along. You've been shooting those ghosts every single day for 20 years, just in operating rooms instead of on a range. Catherine's phone buzzed in her pocket. She almost ignored it, but something made her check the screen. A video call from an unknown number. She answered it. A young man's face appeared, frightened and trying desperately to hide it. Jack, her son, but not calling from his usual number. Calling from somewhere dark and enclosed, his face lit by emergency lighting. "Mom," he said, and his voice carried the kind of control that comes from military training fighting against fear. "Mom, something's happening. They've locked down the academy. Someone called in a bomb threat. They're saying it's related to Fallujah, to you and a guy named Blackwood. Mom, I'm in the armory with 20 other cadets and we can't get out." Catherine's world narrowed to the phone screen, to her son's face, to the reality that the past she had been running from had finally caught up not just to her, but to the person she loved most in the world. "Jack, are you safe? Are you hurt?" "We're okay so far. But Mom, there's a guy. He says his name is Eric Lee. He says he's Marcus Lee's brother. He says he's been watching the live stream from Colorado. He says you and Blackwood killed his brother, and now it's time for justice." The phone shifted, and Catherine saw a different face. A man in his early 30s, eyes red-rimmed and wild, holding what looked like a detonator. "Dr. Catherine Hayes," the man said, and his voice shook with barely controlled rage. "You're going to listen to me very carefully. You and Raymond Blackwood have 6 hours to get to West Point. 6 hours to turn yourselves in to the FBI. 6 hours to confess on national television that you murdered my brother through your cowardice and ambition." "Eric, please," Catherine said. "Your brother's death was tragic, but hurting these cadets won't bring him back." 6 hours, Eric repeated, "or these 20 cadets start dying, starting with your son. You let my brother die. Let's see how you like watching someone you love die while you can't do anything to stop it." The screen went black. Catherine stared at the phone, her mind racing through tactical considerations and maternal panic and the absolute certainty that everything in her life had been leading to this moment. Colonel Hartwell had heard everything. "We need to call the FBI now." But Catherine was already running back toward the lodge, toward Raymond Blackwood, toward the reckoning she had been avoiding for 20 years and could no longer escape. She burst through the lodge doors to find Ray still at the range, arguing with other veterans about whether Catherine's walkout constituted a forfeit. "Ray," she shouted, "we have a problem, a big one." She showed him the video she had recorded on her phone, showed him Eric Lee's face, explained about the bomb threat, the hostages, the 6-hour deadline. Ray's face went pale. "Eric Lee, Jesus Christ. I recruited him, brought him into the Veterans Advocacy Group. He was Marcus's little brother. I thought I was helping him deal with his grief." "Well, you helped him all right," Catherine said. "Helped him plan whatever this is." The television crew had followed her inside, still filming, still broadcasting live. Within minutes, the story was everywhere. Bomb threat at West Point, hostages taken, 2 veterans from a controversial Fallujah mission being demanded for surrender. Catherine's phone rang again. FBI Special Agent Martinez calling from the Joint Terrorism Task Force headquarters in New York. They had the academy locked down. They had Eric Lee contained in the armory building. But he had improvised explosives, had 20 hostages, and had made his demands very clear. "Dr. Hayes, we need you and Mr. Blackwood to cooperate with us. We can handle this situation, but we need time. Can you get to West Point?" Catherine looked at Ray. He looked back at her. And in that moment, 20 years of anger and blame and guilt fell away, replaced by the thing that had always been stronger. The bond between Marines who had survived held together. "We're coming," Catherine said, "but we're not surrendering. We're getting those kids out." She ended the call and turned to Ray. "You with me?" Ray's jaw tightened. Then he nodded. "Always was, Staff Sergeant. Even when I hated you, I was still your spotter. Let's go get our brother's little brother and bring those cadets home." Colonel Hartwell stepped forward. "I'm coming too. This is my fight as much as yours." Within 20 minutes, they were airborne in a private plane arranged by the Veterans Foundation, flying east toward West Point, toward Jack, toward Eric Lee and his bombs, and his grief and his demand for justice. Catherine sat in the plane and checked her rifle, the Remington that Colonel Hartwell had loaned her, the same model she had used in Fallujah, the same platform that had failed to save Jake and Marcus and David. Maybe it could save Jack, Maybe it could save 20 cadets who had nothing to do with a mission 20 years ago. Maybe this was her chance at redemption. Or maybe it was just another impossible choice in a life full of them. The plane climbed toward cruising altitude. The Rocky Mountains fell away below. And Catherine Hayes prepared for one last mission, knowing that this time there would be no following orders. This time she would do whatever it took to bring her son home alive, even if it meant finally pulling the trigger on the ghosts of Fallujah. The plane cut through the darkness at 35,000 feet, engines humming their steady drone while three people who had spent 20 years avoiding each other now sat in silence thick enough to choke on. Catherine stared out the window at nothing, at clouds illuminated by moonlight, at the vast emptiness between Colorado and New York that seemed insignificant compared to the distance she had traveled inside herself in the past 12 hours. Raymond Blackwood sat across the narrow aisle, his prosthetic legs stretched out in front of him, his hands working methodically to check and recheck the pistol that one of the Veteran Foundation members had provided before they left Rocky Mountain. A Glock 19, standard law enforcement issue, 15 rounds of 9mm ammunition that might as well have been 15 drops of water for all the good they would do against a man with explosives and 20 hostages and nothing left to lose. Colonel Vincent Hartwell occupied the seat behind Catherine, and she could hear his labored breathing, the wet rattle in his lungs that spoke of decades of exposure to burn pits and chemical agents in the Gulf War, coming home to claim its final price. He had refused to stay behind, had insisted with the kind of command authority that still worked even at 68 and dying, that this was his fight too, that he had trained both Catherine and the ideology that had led to Fallujah, and he would be damned if he let his students face the consequences alone. Catherine's phone showed 4 hours and 17 minutes remaining on Eric Lee's deadline. 4 hours to fly from Colorado to New York. 4 hours to figure out how to save 20 cadets and her son from a man whose grief had calcified into something hard and sharp and deadly. The FBI had sent her a briefing document, classified eyes only, rushed through approval because the situation demanded it. Catherine read it on her tablet screen, the blue light harsh in the darkened cabin. Eric Jonathan Lee, age 33, born in San Francisco to Korean immigrant parents who had worked themselves to exhaustion running a small grocery store in the Tenderloin district. Older brother Marcus had joined the Marines to pay for college, to lift the family out of poverty, to be the success story that immigrant parents dream about for their children. Marcus had died in a stairwell in Fallujah 3 weeks before he was supposed to come home. Eric had been 12 years old when his brother died. 12 years old when Marine officers in dress blues came to the grocery store and told his parents that Marcus had died a hero, had thrown himself on a grenade to save his brothers, had been recommended for the Navy Cross posthumously. 12 years old when the Navy Cross recommendation was quietly withdrawn because the after-action report from Fallujah raised questions about command decisions and rules of engagement and whether the mission had been worth the cost. The file documented Eric's descent with clinical precision: high school dropout at 16, juvenile detention for assault at 17, but then a turnaround, joining the Army at 18, volunteering for explosive ordnance disposal training, serving 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, receiving commendations for bravery and technical skill. Then the crash, a roadside bomb in Kandahar that killed 3 members of Eric's EOD team while he watched through binoculars from a safe position, unable to help, unable to save them, just like Catherine had been unable to save her team in Fallujah. Medical discharge for PTSD, 2 suicide attempts, 5 years of homelessness and substance abuse, then finally contact with Raymond Blackwood's Veterans Advocacy Group, which had pulled Eric back from the edge, given him purpose, given him community, given him access to other veterans of Fallujah who still carried their own rage about that day. Catherine looked up from the tablet to find Ray watching her. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "about Eric's background, about the EOD team he lost. I thought I was helping him heal, bringing him into the group, giving him brothers to replace the one he lost." "You were helping him," Catherine said, "until you decided to use the memorial shoot to settle scores with me. Eric was watching the live stream, Ray, watching you humiliate me, watching me break down at the shooting line, and he decided that if I wouldn't face justice your way, he'd make me face it his way." Ray's jaw tightened. "So this is my fault now?" "It's all of our faults," Colonel Hartwell said from behind them, his voice rough with exhaustion and illness. "Every choice we made, every action we took, they all led here. Catherine following orders. Ray nursing his grudge. Me training you both to be killers and then sending you to a war where killing wasn't enough to win. He coughed, a wet hacking sound that went on too long. Eric Lee is just the latest casualty of Fallujah. Won't be the last either. The plane began its descent into Newark Liberty International. FBI Special Agent Martinez had arranged ground transportation, a helicopter that would take them directly to West Point. They would arrive with 90 minutes left on the deadline. 90 minutes to talk down a trained EOD technician who knew exactly how much explosive force was required to kill 20 people in an enclosed space. 90 minutes to save Jack. Catherine closed her eyes and saw her son's face on that video call. 19 years old, trying so hard to be brave, to be the Marine his father had been and his mother had pretended not to be. She thought about David, her husband, who had died throwing himself on a grenade in Afghanistan. David, who had understood the cost of heroism better than anyone. If he were here now, what would he tell her to do? The answer came immediately in David's voice from across the years. Do what you do best, Kat. Be the sniper. Be still. Be patient. Wait for the shot. But what if the shot never came? What if the situation had no solution, no angle, no way to save everyone? Then you save who you can, David's memory whispered, and you live with the rest. The helicopter landed at West Point just after midnight. Catherine had been to the academy once before, years ago, when Jack had been accepted as a cadet. She remembered the grandeur of it, the Gothic stone buildings perched above the Hudson River, the monuments to centuries of military tradition, the weight of history in every stone and tree. Now it looked like a war zone. Floodlights illuminated the armory building where Eric Lee held his hostages. FBI hostage rescue team vehicles surrounded the perimeter. Snipers occupied positions on adjacent rooftops. News helicopters circled at a distance, their cameras broadcasting the standoff to the world. Special Agent Martinez met them as they climbed out of the helicopter. She was 40-something, dark hair pulled back severely, eyes that had seen too many situations like this end badly. Dr. Hayes, Mr. Blackwood, Colonel Hartwell, I need to be very clear about the parameters here. This is an FBI operation. You are civilians. You will not be armed. You will not make tactical decisions, and you will follow our instructions exactly. Is that understood? What's the current situation? Catherine asked, ignoring the question. Martinez's lips thinned, but she answered. Eric Lee has 20 cadets secured in the armory's basement storage area. He's rigged 3 improvised explosive devices, C4 based on our analysis with remote detonators. He has the trigger on his person. If we breach, he detonates. If we don't meet his demands, he detonates. What are his demands? Ray asked. He wants you two to confess on live television that you murdered his brother through negligence and cowardice. He wants you to apologize to him personally. And then he wants you to turn yourselves over to civilian authorities for prosecution. That's insane, Ray said. There's no legal basis for prosecution. We followed orders. The investigation cleared us. I'm aware, Martinez said, but Eric Lee isn't operating on logic right now. He's operating on grief and rage and 20 years of trauma. He watched his brother get memorialized and then forgotten. He watched the Navy Cross recommendation get withdrawn. He watched you, Mr. Blackwood, use a memorial event to publicly attack Dr. Hayes. And something in him snapped. Catherine looked toward the armory building. Has he hurt anyone? No, actually, that's the strange part. He's been almost gentle with the cadets. Gave them water. Let them use bathroom facilities one at a time. Your son Jack has been trying to talk him down, apparently. Lee seems to respect him. Can I talk to Jack? Martinez hesitated, then nodded. She handed Catherine a radio. Channel 7, Lee's been allowing brief communications. Catherine keyed the microphone. Jack, it's Mom. Can you hear me? Static, then her son's voice, steady despite the circumstances. Mom, I'm okay. We're all okay. But Mom, this guy, he's not really a terrorist. He's just broken. He keeps talking about his brother, about how nobody remembers him. He keeps crying and apologizing to us for scaring us. In the background, Catherine heard another voice. Eric Lee, younger than she expected, raw with emotion. Is that her? Is that Catherine Hayes? Eric, Catherine said, using the tone she employed with trauma patients in shock, calm and authoritative and human. My name is Catherine. I'm here. I came like you asked. With Blackwood? Yes, Ray's here too. We're both here. We want to talk to you. No more talking. Eric's voice cracked. 20 years of talking and nothing changes. They said Marcus was a hero, but they won't even say his name. They pulled his Navy Cross because of your report, Dr. Hayes. Because you wrote that the mission was compromised by poor tactical decisions. You made it sound like my brother died for nothing. Catherine felt the words like a punch. She had written that report, had been ordered to document everything that went wrong in Fallujah, had told the truth as she saw it, knowing it would have consequences, not realizing one of those consequences would be the withdrawal of Marcus Lee's posthumous honor. Eric, your brother was a hero. I was there. I saw what he did. He saved 3 lives when he jumped on that grenade. Then why did they take away his medal? Because the Marine Corps doesn't like admitting when missions go wrong. Because they needed someone to blame, and they chose the mission instead of the Marines who died trying to complete it. But Eric, listen to me. Marcus was a hero. I've never doubted that. Then come in here and tell me to my face. Eric's voice had shifted, becoming eerily calm. You and Blackwood, come into the armory, unarmed, alone. Tell me the truth about that day. All of it. And maybe I let these kids go. Martinez was already shaking her head before Eric finished speaking. Absolutely not. We don't send civilians into a hostage situation. But Catherine was already unbuckling her tactical vest. I'm going in. Dr. Hayes, I can't allow that. Then arrest me, Catherine said flatly, because I'm going to walk toward that building in about 30 seconds, and your only choices are to shoot me or arrest me or let me try to save my son. She looked at Ray. He was already standing, already removing his own vest. Someone has to spot for you, Staff Sergeant. That's always been my job. Colonel Hartwell struggled to his feet, but Catherine put a hand on his shoulder. No, sir, you've done enough. Let us finish this. The old man's eyes were wet. Catherine, Ray, listen to me. What happened in Fallujah, the choice you made, Catherine, it was an impossible situation. I've thought about it for 20 years. There was no right answer. I know, sir, but there is a right answer now, and it's not getting yourself killed trying to fix the past. He gripped her hand with surprising strength. Your son needs you alive, not heroic. Catherine leaned down and kissed the colonel's weathered forehead. Then I better make sure I stay alive. She and Ray walked toward the armory building together, crossing the floodlit quad while dozens of law enforcement officers and snipers watched through scopes and night vision. Catherine's hands were empty but steady. Ray moved beside her with the rolling gait of someone whose prosthetic leg had become second nature. They reached the armory door. It opened from inside, pulled by a cadet who looked terrified but determined. Beyond him in the dim emergency lighting, Catherine could see the other hostages sitting against the wall. Jack was among them, and when he saw his mother, his composure finally cracked. Tears rolled down his face, but he did not speak. Eric Lee stood in the center of the room, holding a dead man's switch in his right hand. He was younger than Catherine expected, Asian features carrying the same determined expression she remembered from his brother's face. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, looking more like a college student than a bomber. But the explosive vest he wore was real enough. Catherine could see the blocks of C4, the detonator wires, the simple spring-loaded switch that would complete the circuit if Eric released pressure. A dead man's switch designed so that killing the bomber would detonate the explosives. Classic suicide bomber configuration. Close the door, Eric said. His voice was steady now, almost gentle. Ray closed it. The sound echoed in the concrete room like a tomb ceiling. Eric studied them both, his eyes moving from Catherine to Ray and back. You look older, both of you. I've been watching videos of you from 20 years ago. You looked different then. Younger. Still had hope in your eyes. We all looked different then, Catherine said quietly. War ages you in ways that have nothing to do with years. My brother never got to age. He stayed 19 forever, perfect and heroic and dead. Eric's hand trembled slightly on the dead man's switch. Do you know what it's like, growing up with a ghost? Having everyone tell you how brave your brother was, how much he sacrificed, but never being able to talk to him, never being able to ask him if it was worth it? No, Catherine said, but I know what it's like to lose brothers. I know what it's like to watch good people die and wonder if you could have saved them. Could you have? Eric's eyes locked onto hers. Could you have saved Marcus if you had just disobeyed your orders and helped your team? The question hung in the air. Catherine could feel Jack watching her, could feel all 20 cadets waiting for her answer, could feel the weight of 20 years pressing down on this single moment. I don't know, she said, and the honesty of it seemed to surprise Eric. Maybe, If I had abandoned my post and gone down to help, maybe I could have gotten to Marcus before he jumped on that grenade. Maybe I could have pulled him to safety. Or maybe the convoy would have been wiped out and 47 more Marines would have died. Or maybe I would have died too and accomplished nothing. I don't know. I've run that scenario in my head 10,000 times and I still don't know. Ray spoke up then, his voice rough. I blamed her for 20 years, Eric. I told myself that Catherine was a coward, that she chose strangers over family, that she let Marcus and Jake and David die because she was too afraid to disobey orders. He paused and Catherine saw tears on his face for the first time since Fallujah. But I was wrong. She wasn't afraid. She was following the training we all received. She was doing her duty, and I hated her for it because it was easier than admitting that sometimes duty demands impossible choices. Eric's hand trembled harder on the switch. So you're saying my brother's death was just bad luck? Just the cost of doing business? No, Catherine said firmly. Your brother's death was a tragedy, a waste, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, dying in a war that shouldn't have been fought the way we fought it. But Eric, Marcus didn't die because of cowardice or negligence. He died because he was brave. Because when that grenade landed among his brothers, he chose to save them. That was his choice. Not mine, not Ray's, his. She took a step closer, and Eric tensed but did not back away. And you know what else? I think about your brother every single day. Every morning when I go to work at the VA hospital, I see his face. Every time I save a veteran on my operating table, I'm trying to balance the equation. I'm trying to make his death mean something. It doesn't mean anything, Eric said, but his voice cracked. He's just gone. They pulled his Navy cross. His name isn't on any memorial. It's like he never existed. His name is on a memorial, Ray said quietly. It's on a clinic in Denver. Catherine named it after him, the Marcus Lee Memorial Clinic. It treats veterans with PTSD and trauma injuries. Hundreds of guys have been through there. Hundreds of lives saved in your brother's name. Eric blinked, surprised. I didn't know that. How could you? Catherine said. You were 12 when he died. Your parents probably protected you from the worst of it. And then when you grew up, all you had were the official records, the withdrawn medal, the sanitized reports that made it sound like Fallujah was just another day at the office. She moved closer still, now only about 6 feet from the bomber. But it wasn't. It was hell. And your brother died a hero in that hell. I saw it. Ray saw it. The 3 Marines he saved with his body, they saw it. We're witnesses, Eric. We remember. Eric's face crumpled. The hand holding the dead man's switch shook violently. Then why does it still hurt so much? Why can't I let him go? Because he was your brother, Catherine said softly. And you loved him. And grief doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't heal just because someone tells you to move on. She held out her hand, palm up, non-threatening. But Eric, those cadets behind you, they have brothers too. They have parents who love them. Jack is my son. He's all I have left of his father, who died throwing himself on a grenade just like Marcus did. If you kill these kids, you're not honoring your brother's sacrifice. You're creating 20 more families who have to live with the kind of pain yours has lived with. Eric looked at the cadets, really looked at them for the first time. Catherine could see the recognition in his eyes, the understanding that he had become the thing he hated most. Another person making impossible choices that would echo for decades. I don't want to hurt them, he whispered. I just wanted someone to care that Marcus died. I wanted someone to remember. We remember, Ray said, and he moved to stand beside Catherine. And we'll make sure everyone remembers. We'll fight to get Marcus his Navy Cross back. We'll tell his story. We'll make sure his name lives on. He paused. But you have to let these kids go. You have to choose right now what Marcus's legacy will be. Hero who saved lives, or excuse for more death? Eric's hand on the dead man's switch relaxed slightly. Catherine could see him warring with himself, grief and rage and exhaustion all fighting for control. Then a voice came from among the cadets, Jack, standing up despite the danger, walking forward until he stood beside his mother. Eric, Jack said, and his voice carried the authority of 3 generations of Marines. My father died in Afghanistan saving his brothers. My grandfather died in the Pentagon on 9/11 saving people from the wreckage. My mother carries the guilt of Fallujah every single day. He met Eric's eyes. But you know what they all had in common? They chose to save people, not hurt them. Your brother made that same choice. Don't dishonor him by making the opposite one. Catherine wanted to pull her son back, to shield him from the bomber, but she understood what Jack was doing. He was offering Eric a path out, a way to end this that preserved Marcus Lee's memory as something noble instead of twisted. Eric looked at Jack for a long moment. Then he looked down at the dead man's switch in his hand. "I'm so tired," he said, and he sounded like the 12-year-old boy who had lost his brother. "I'm so tired of being angry, of being alone, of missing him, of—" "I know," Catherine said, "but it doesn't have to end like this. You can let go of the switch. You can let these kids go home. And we can help you. Ray and we can help you find a way to honor Marcus that doesn't involve more death." Eric's hand trembled one more time. Then slowly, carefully, he transferred the dead man's switch to his left hand, freeing his right. He reached for the buckle of his explosive vest, and that was when everything went wrong. The armory door exploded inward, breached by an FBI tactical team who had apparently decided they could not wait any longer. Flashbang grenades detonated, filling the room with blinding light and deafening sound. Operators in tactical gear poured through the opening, weapons raised, screaming commands. Eric Lee's startled hand clenched on the dead man's switch. Catherine saw it happening as if in slow motion, saw Eric's fingers tightening, saw the panic in his eyes, saw the cadets scrambling away from the blast radius they would never escape. She did not think, did not calculate, did not weigh options or consider consequences. She lunged forward and grabbed Eric's wrist, forcing his hand open, keeping pressure on the switch so it would not release. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and explosive components, Catherine's full weight pinning Eric to the concrete floor. "Don't let go," she said into his ear, her voice barely audible over the shouting and chaos. "Don't let go of the switch. I've got you. Just don't let go." FBI operators swarmed over them. Someone was cutting the wires to the explosive vest. Someone else was securing Eric's hands. Catherine maintained her grip on his wrist, on the switch, refusing to release until an EOD technician told her it was safe. 5 minutes later, the vest was defused. Eric Lee was in custody. The 20 cadets were being evacuated, checked for injuries, reunited with frantic parents and academy officials. Catherine sat on the concrete floor, her whole body shaking with adrenaline crash, and felt her son's arms around her. "Mom," Jack said, and he was crying openly now. "Mom, you saved us. You saved everyone." But Catherine was not thinking about the people she had saved. She was thinking about the FBI tactical team that had breached when they should have waited. Thinking about how close it had been, how easily it could have ended with 20 dead cadets in an exploded armory and more names for memorial walls. She was thinking about impossible choices and split-second decisions, and the fact that even after 20 years, she was still making them. Ray found them there, Jack holding his mother while she shook. He sat down beside them without a word, and for a moment the three of them just existed in silence. Survivors of different battles united by the simple fact of survival. Eventually, Special Agent Martinez came to debrief them. She was furious about the tactical team's premature breach, was already on the phone with superiors promising investigations and consequences. But she also grudgingly admitted that Catherine's quick action had probably saved lives. "You should never have gone in there," Martinez said, "but since you did, thank you." They were taken to a command post for medical evaluation and statements. Catherine learned that Colonel Hartwell had collapsed during the breach, his weakened heart unable to take the stress. He was alive but in critical condition at the West Point Hospital. She went to him immediately, still wearing the same clothes, still smelling of fear and concrete dust. The old colonel lay in a hospital bed hooked to monitors that beeped and hummed their electronic vigil. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by illness and age, and the weight of watching his students walk into danger one more time. But when Catherine entered the room, his eyes opened and focused on her with the same sharp intelligence she remembered from 24 years ago. "Did you save them?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, sir, everyone's safe." "Good." He smiled, and it transformed his weathered face into something almost peaceful. "Then my last students didn't fail their final test." "Sir, don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." But Hartwell shook his head slightly. "We both know that's not true, Catherine. The doctors have been telling me for years. I've just been on borrowed time." He reached out and grasped her hand with surprising strength. "But I need to tell you something before I go. Something I should have said 20 years ago." Catherine leaned closer, and Jack, who had followed her into the room, stood at the foot of the bed listening. "What happened in Fallujah?" Hartwell said. "The choice you made." I've run that scenario in my head 1,000 times, trying to figure out if there was a right answer. And you know what I realized? What, sir? There wasn't a right answer. There was only your answer. And you made it for the right reasons, trying to save the most lives possible. That's all any warrior can do. His grip on her hand tightened. But here's what I really need you to understand. Being a good Marine isn't about making perfect decisions. It's about living with the imperfect ones, about carrying the weight of command, of choice, of consequence. You've been carrying that weight for 20 years. Don't you think it's time to put some of it down? Tears rolled down Catherine's face. I don't know how, sir. Start by forgiving yourself, Hartwell said. Jake and Marcus and David, they're not sitting in judgment of you. They're at peace. The only person still fighting that battle is you. He looked past Catherine to Jack. And your son needs you present, not haunted. Jack moved to his mother's side, taking her other hand. Hartwell smiled at them both. 3 generations of warriors. But Jack, you listen to me. Being a warrior doesn't mean being a killer. Your grandfather understood that. Your father understood that. And your mother, she spent 20 years proving it, saving lives instead of taking them. I understand, sir, Jack said. Good. Hartwell's eyes started to close. Now let an old man rest. I'm tired. So damn tired. Catherine sat with him for another hour while he drifted in and out of consciousness. The monitors beeped slower. His breathing became more labored. The nurses came and went with sympathetic looks and gentle suggestions that maybe she should get some rest. But she stayed. Because Colonel Vincent Hartwell had taught her to shoot and to think and to survive. And the least she could do was sit vigil while he finally laid down his rifle. He died just before dawn, with Catherine holding one hand and Ray, who had come to pay his respects, holding the other. His last words were barely audible. Something about the Gulf War and a village he had not bombed and the families who had lived because of it. Worth it, he whispered. They lived, had families. Worth it. Then he was gone, and Catherine sat in the silence of the hospital room and felt something shift inside her. A door closing on one part of her life, another opening on whatever came next. She walked out of the hospital into a gray dawn. Jack was waiting, along with Ray, who had not left despite having every reason to disappear back into his own life. What happens now? Jack asked. Catherine looked at her son, at Ray, at the academy grounds where young people were beginning to stir and move toward another day of training. Another step toward becoming warriors who would face their own impossible choices. Now, she said, we remember, we honor, and we try to do better than we did before. She thought about Eric Lee sitting in a federal detention cell, facing charges, but also facing the psychiatric help he should have received 20 years ago. She thought about the Marcus Lee Memorial Clinic and wondered if Eric might eventually work there, turning his pain into service the way she had. She thought about Ray, who had spent 20 years hating her and now stood beside her like the spotter he had always been, watching her back, covering her angles. She thought about Fallujah and the choice she had made, and the 3 Marines who had died because of it. And for the first time in 20 years, she thought about them without the crushing weight of guilt that had defined her every moment since. They had been warriors. They had made their own choices. Jake defending his brothers, Marcus jumping on a grenade, David bleeding out while she followed orders. She could honor them without destroying herself in the process. Mom, Jack said, concerned by her silence. Catherine pulled her son close, held him tight, and whispered the words she had been unable to say for 2 decades. I did my best, and my best wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Ray put a hand on her shoulder, not forgiveness exactly, because some things are too big for forgiveness, but understanding, acknowledgement. The recognition that they had both been doing their best in an impossible situation, and that holding on to anger was just another way of letting Fallujah kill them slowly. Come on, Catherine said, let's go home. They walked together across the quad, 3 people bound by trauma and loss and the strange grace of survival. Behind them, West Point continued its ancient mission of transforming civilians into officers. The stone buildings and monuments standing witness to centuries of warriors who had faced their own impossible choices. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the Hudson River and the mountains and the complicated geography of guilt and redemption, the sun was rising on another day that Catherine Hayes had survived to see. Not redeemed, not forgiven, not free from the past, but still here, still fighting, still trying to balance an equation that could never truly be balanced, but had to be attempted anyway. Because that was what warriors did. They carried the weight, they made the choices, they lived with the consequences, and they kept moving forward, one step at a time, one day at a time, until either the war ended or they did. 3 months after West Point, Catherine Hayes stood in the chapel at Arlington National Cemetery and watched them lower Colonel Vincent Hartwell into ground that had received warriors for 160 years. The honor guard folded the flag with mechanical precision. Each movement practiced 10,000 times until it became muscle memory, until honor became reflex. They presented it to no one, because Hartwell had outlived his wife by 15 years and his 2 sons by longer than that, one buried in Section 60 from Fallujah, and the other in the same section from a different war in the same cursed country. So Catherine accepted the flag on behalf of the Marine Corps Scout sniper community, and she held it against her chest while a bugler played taps and the cold February wind cut through her dress blues like it was searching for the warmest part of her to freeze. The cemetery was full of people who had known Hartwell in different seasons of his long life. Gulf War veterans with silver hair and campaign ribbons, Iraq and Afghanistan Marines who had trained under him at Quantico, snipers from multiple generations who had learned their craft from his textbooks and training videos even if they had never met the man himself. A whole generation of warriors bound together by the simple fact that Vincent Hartwell had taught them how to kill efficiently and, more importantly, when not to. Raymond Blackwood stood beside Catherine in his own dress blues, the left leg of his trousers pressed and perfect despite covering carbon fiber and hydraulics instead of flesh and bone. He had flown in from Detroit, where he now worked full-time at a Veterans Outreach Center, his anger channeled finally into something constructive, something that honored the men he had lost instead of punishing the woman he blamed for losing them. Jack Morrison stood on Catherine's other side, ramrod straight in his cadet uniform, learning the rituals of military grief that would serve him too well in whatever future wars his generation would be asked to fight. He had changed since West Point, had lost some essential innocence that Catherine wished she could have protected, but knew was inevitable. You cannot watch your mother prevent a suicide bombing and remain unchanged. The service concluded with a 3-volley salute, rifles barking in the winter air, and then it was over, and people began to drift away to their cars and their lives in the complicated business of living after burying another piece of the past. But Catherine did not leave. She stood at the graveside while the cemetery workers began filling in the hole, and she thought about all the conversations she had never had with Hartwell, all the questions she had never asked, all the forgiveness she had never quite managed to accept from him, because accepting it would mean forgiving herself. "He wouldn't want you standing here in the cold," Ray said quietly. "He'd tell you to get moving, keep your blood flowing, stay mission-focused." I know what he'd say. Catherine looked at the gravestone being set in place. Vincent James Hartwell, USMC, 1946 to 2025. And below that, a simple inscription. "He taught warriors to think. But I'm not ready to leave yet." Ray was silent for a moment, then he spoke words that surprised them both. "I've been going to therapy. Real therapy, not just the VA counseling, a civilian psychiatrist who specializes in combat trauma." Catherine turned to look at him. "How's that going?" "Hard. She makes me talk about Fallujah, about losing my leg, about the 20 years I spent hating you." He met her eyes. "About the 20 years I wasted being angry instead of healing." "You had a right to be angry. Having a right to something doesn't mean it's good for you." "I had a right to be angry. I also had a right to let it destroy my marriage, alienate my kids, drink myself into cirrhosis, and die bitter and alone. I was exercising all those rights until West Point made me realize that I was just inflicting on myself what I thought you deserved." The cemetery workers had finished their labor and departed, leaving fresh dirt and the smell of earth and mortality. Catherine and Ray stood alone now, Jack having moved a respectful distance away to give them privacy. "The therapist asked me something last week," Ray continued. "She asked me what I would have done if I was the one on the rifle that day instead of you. If I had to choose between covering the convoy and helping the team." He paused, and Catherine could see the pain of the question in his face. "I told her I honestly didn't know. And she said that was the answer. That the impossible thing about impossible choices is that you don't know what you'll do until you're in that moment. You just hope you can live with yourself after." Catherine felt something crack open in her chest, some fortress wall she had built to contain 20 years of guilt and grief. "I think about them every day, Ray. Jake and Marcus and David. I see their faces. I hear their voices on the radio. I feel the weight of that rifle and the weight of the choice. and the weight of every life I've saved since trying to make up for the three I didn't. I know. Ray's voice was gentle in a way she had forgotten it could be. But Catherine, you can't save your way out of grief. Trust me, I tried to hate my way out of it, and that didn't work either. At some point, you just have to feel it and let it be and keep living anyway. They stood together in silence, two people who had spent 20 years as enemies learning slowly how to be something else. Not friends exactly, because friendship required a foundation that their shared trauma had shattered. But maybe brothers in arms again. Maybe witnesses to each other's survival. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text message. Dr. Michael Brennan from Denver Via Hospital. The message was brief and businesslike, but she could read the concern between the lines. Eric Lee's case was moving forward. Federal prosecutors wanted to make an example of him despite the clear evidence of PTSD and mental health crisis. They were pushing for terrorism charges that could mean life imprisonment. The Lee case, Catherine said, showing Ray the message. They're trying to put him away forever. Can't say he doesn't deserve it. He held 20 kids hostage with a bomb. He's a veteran with untreated PTSD who lost his entire EOD team and never got help. He's what happens when we send people to war and then forget about them when they come home broken. Catherine pocketed her phone. I'm going to testify at his sentencing hearing. Character witness, advocate for treatment instead of incarceration. Ray looked skeptical. You're going to defend the guy who threatened to blow up your son? I'm going to defend a Marine's little brother who deserved better than what he got. Marcus Lee died a hero, and the Marine Corps thanked his family by pulling his Navy Cross and forgetting his name. Eric spent 20 years watching that injustice fester. I'm not saying what he did was right, but I understand why he did it. The prosecutor's not gonna like you. The prosecutor can join the very long list of people who don't like me. Catherine started walking toward the parking area where Jack waited by their rental car. But I'm going to do it anyway, because if we can't take care of our own, if we can't extend grace to the people broken by the same wars that broke us, then what the hell did we fight for? Ray caught up to her, his prosthetic making his gait slightly uneven on the cemetery's manicured grass. You know, the therapist said something else. She said that sometimes the people we think are our enemies are just mirrors showing us the parts of ourselves we're most afraid to face. I hated you because you made a choice I was terrified I would have made too. You remind me that sometimes there are no good options, only different kinds of bad ones. That's depressing. Yeah, but it's also true. And once I accepted it, once I stopped needing you to be the villain in my story, I could finally start dealing with my own stuff. He paused at the parking area. So I guess what I'm saying is thank you for going into that armory, for stopping Eric, for not giving up on any of us, even when we gave up on you. Catherine felt tears on her face and did not bother to wipe them away. You're welcome. And Ray, I'm sorry for Fallujah, for the choice I made, for not being brave enough to disobey orders, for all of it. I know you are. Ray pulled her into an embrace, awkward and stiff, because neither of them was comfortable with physical affection, but genuine in a way that 20 years of anger had not permitted. And I'm sorry for making you carry that alone for so long. They held each other while Jack watched from a distance, seeing his mother finally release some of the weight she had been carrying since before he was born. Seeing her become something slightly more human and slightly less haunted. The flight back to Denver gave Catherine time to think, to plan, to consider how she might actually help Eric Lee when the whole weight of the federal justice system wanted to crush him as an example. She called Dr. Brennan from the airport and asked him to compile Eric's military records, his medical evaluations, his PTSD assessments, everything that might demonstrate diminished capacity and mental health crisis rather than calculated terrorism. She called the VA's legal advocacy office and got them involved. She reached out to veterans organizations that specialized in supporting former service members facing criminal charges. She built a network of support for a man she had never met before the night he held her son hostage, because that man was a Marine's brother, and that meant something in the complicated algebra of military loyalty. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for late March, which gave Catherine 6 weeks to prepare her testimony and to do something else she had been avoiding for 20 years. She drove to San Francisco and found the small grocery store in the Tenderloin, where Eric Lee's parents still work 7 days a week, still trying to build the American dream that had cost them their oldest son. The store was exactly what Catherine expected. Narrow aisles packed with goods, the smell of incense and preserved vegetables, Korean pop music playing softly from a radio behind the counter. An older couple worked the register, both small and weathered by decades of long hours and hard labor. Catherine approached them with the same careful caution she would use approaching a potential IED. One wrong word and the whole thing could explode. "Mr. and Mrs. Lee, my name is Catherine Hayes. I served with your son Marcus in Iraq." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Lee's face crumpled. Mr. Lee's hands clenched on the counter. 20 years had not diminished their grief, had only taught them how to carry it quietly. "You knew Marcus?" Mrs. Lee's English was accented but clear. "Yes, ma'am. I was his team leader. I was there when he died." Mr. Lee's eyes hardened. "Then you are the one who let him die." Catherine did not flinch from the accusation. "Yes, sir. I was ordered to maintain my position to cover a convoy. Your son died while I followed those orders. I've lived with that choice every day since." "Why you come here?" Mrs. Lee asked, and there was no hostility in her voice, only exhaustion. "Why you bring back the pain?" "Because I need to tell you something about Marcus. Something I should have told you 20 years ago." Catherine pulled out her phone and showed them a photograph. The Marcus Lee Memorial Clinic in Denver, its sign prominent above the entrance. "This is a clinic that treats veterans with PTSD and trauma injuries. It's named after your son. Hundreds of veterans have been treated there, lives saved in Marcus's name." Mrs. Lee took the phone with shaking hands, staring at the photograph. Tears rolled down her face. Marcus's name. They remember him. They remember him because he was a hero, because he threw himself on a grenade to save his brothers, because he made a choice that most people couldn't make. Catherine's voice was steady despite the emotion churning in her chest. "The Marine Corps pulled his Navy Cross recommendation for political reasons that had nothing to do with his bravery. But the people who were there, we know the truth. We've never forgotten." Mr. Lee's rigid posture softened slightly. "Eric, our other son, he is in jail because of what he did, because he could not let go of Marcus." "I know. That's why I'm here. I'm going to testify at his sentencing hearing. I'm going to tell the judge that Eric is a veteran who needed help and didn't get it, that his actions came from grief and PTSD, not from terrorism. I'm going to ask for treatment instead of imprisonment." "Why you do this?" Mr. Lee asked. "Eric, he threatened your son. He could have killed many people." "Because Eric is Marcus's brother. Because the way we honor the dead is by taking care of the living. Because I failed Marcus, but maybe I don't have to fail Eric too." Catherine met their eyes. "And because your family has sacrificed enough for this country, you gave your oldest son to a war. You shouldn't have to lose your youngest son to a prison." Mrs. Lee came around the counter and did something Catherine did not expect. She hugged her, the small Korean woman embracing the Marine who had failed to save her son, and she whispered words in Catherine's ear that broke something fundamental inside her. "Marcus would not want you to suffer. He would want you to live, to be happy, to forgive yourself." Catherine held this stranger who understood grief in ways most people never would, and she cried for the first time since Colonel Hartwell's funeral. Cried for Marcus and Jake and David. Cried for Eric sitting in a federal detention cell. Cried for herself in the 20 years she had spent trying to atone for a choice that had no right answer. When she finally pulled away, Mr. Lee was crying too. He reached under the counter and pulled out a shoebox, old and battered, and inside were Marcus's things from Iraq. Letters he had sent home, photographs of him with his team, his dog tags returned with his body. "You take," Mr. Lee said, holding out a photograph. It showed Marcus Lee in his combat utilities, grinning at the camera, surrounded by his brothers in arms. Jake Stevens was in the photo. So was David Chen. So was Catherine, younger and harder, and not yet broken by the choice she would make 3 weeks after that photograph was taken. "I can't take this," Catherine said. "Yes, you take. You are his family too. You carry him too. You remember together." Mr. Lee pressed the photograph into her hands. "And you help Eric. You help our son come home." Catherine left the grocery store with the photograph and a promise, and a sense that maybe finally she was doing something right in the long, complicated aftermath of Fallujah. The sentencing hearing took place in federal court in Manhattan on a gray March day that felt like winter refusing to admit defeat. The courtroom was packed with reporters and victims' families and veterans groups on both sides of the issue. Some veterans saw Eric Lee as a hero who had been pushed too far by an ungrateful nation. Others saw him as a terrorist who had dishonored the uniform. Catherine sat in the witness gallery next to Raymond Blackwood, who had flown in from Detroit to add his voice to the chorus asking for mercy. Jack was there too, along with several of the cadets who had been held hostage. The presence of the victims asking for leniency rather than vengeance had shocked the prosecutors and confused the media. Eric Lee sat at the defense table looking small and defeated, dressed in an orange jumpsuit that made him look like a convict rather than a veteran. His public defender was young and earnest and outmatched by the federal prosecutors who wanted to make this case a warning to anyone who might consider using violence to make political statements. The prosecution laid out their case with brutal efficiency: terrorism charges, weapons of mass destruction, kidnapping, assault. They painted Eric as a calculating extremist who had planned and executed a coordinated attack on a military installation. They showed photographs of the explosive vest, the improvised devices, the terrified cadets. They called him a clear and present danger to society who deserved the maximum sentence. Then the defense called their witnesses. First was a psychiatrist who specialized in combat trauma. She testified about Eric's PTSD, about the EOD team he had lost in Afghanistan, about the cascade of mental health crises that had gone untreated, despite multiple attempts to seek help from the VA. She explained how grief and survivor's guilt can manifest as rage when the underlying trauma is not addressed. She described Eric not as a terrorist, but as a casualty of war who needed treatment, not punishment. Then Catherine took the stand. The prosecutor eyed her warily. He had read her background, knew she was the mother of one of the hostages, knew her testimony could undermine his entire case if the jury believed her. Dr. Hayes, can you tell the court about your relationship to the defendant? I don't have a relationship with Eric Lee, but I served with his brother, Marcus Lee, in Fallujah in 2004. I was Marcus's team leader when he died. And you're here to defend the man who held your son hostage? I'm here to provide context. Eric Lee is not a terrorist. He's a veteran suffering from untreated PTSD who made a terrible decision in the grip of a mental health crisis. What he did was wrong, but it came from a place of pain, not from ideology or hatred. The prosecutor pressed it harder. Your son could have died because of this man's actions. How can you sit here and ask for mercy? Catherine met the prosecutor's eyes and spoke with the same calm authority she used in operating rooms. Because my son is alive, all 20 cadets are alive. Nobody was hurt. And that's because Eric Lee, despite his pain and his rage and his explosives, chose not to hurt anyone. He had multiple opportunities to detonate those devices. He didn't. Because at his core, he's still a soldier who was trained to protect, not to harm. She turned to address the judge directly. Your Honor, I've spent 20 years trying to atone for a choice I made in combat that resulted in the deaths of 3 Marines, including Marcus Lee. I can't bring those men back, but I can make sure that Marcus's brother doesn't become another casualty of the same war that took Marcus. Eric needs help, not a life sentence. He needs treatment, not punishment. And as a nation, we owe him that much for his service and for his brother's sacrifice. The prosecutor tried to object, but the judge waved him down. Let her finish. The way we treat our veterans when they're broken says everything about who we are as a country. Eric Lee served honorably. He lost his team. He came home traumatized and couldn't get the help he needed. Yes, what he did was criminal. Yes, it was dangerous. But it was also a cry for help that we should have heard years ago. Please, Your Honor, give him a chance to heal instead of condemning him to die in a federal prison. Raymond Blackwood testified next, telling the judge about his own 20 years of untreated anger, about how close he had come to doing something equally destructive before finding help. He talked about the brotherhood of Marines, about how that brotherhood extends to the families of fallen warriors, about how failure to care for Eric Lee would dishonor Marcus Lee's memory. Then Jack Morrison took the stand and the courtroom went silent. The prosecutor tried to object. Your Honor, the victim is a minor. I'm 19 years old, Jack said firmly. I'm a cadet at the United States Military Academy, and I'm old enough to testify about what happened to me. The judge allowed it. Jack sat in the witness box in his dress gray uniform and spoke with a maturity beyond his years. Eric Lee held me and 19 other cadets hostage for 6 hours. He had bombs. He had a detonator. He could have killed all of us, but he didn't. He gave us water. He let us use the bathroom. He apologized for scaring us. He told us about his brother and why he was so angry. And you know what I realized? He didn't want to hurt us. He wanted someone to acknowledge that his brother had mattered. That's all. Jack paused, and Catherine saw her son transform from a scared kid into a warrior finding his voice. My father died in Afghanistan. My grandfather died on 9/11. My mother carries the weight of Fallujah every single day, and I've learned something from all of that. We honor the dead by how we treat the living. Eric Lee deserves to be held accountable for what he did, but he also deserves the help that he should have gotten years ago. Send him to treatment. Give him a chance to heal. Let him honor his brother's memory by living a life that means something instead of rotting in a cell. The prosecution had no rebuttal to a victim asking for mercy. The defense rested. The judge took a recess to consider the testimony and the sentencing guidelines in the complicated intersection of justice and compassion. Catherine sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Ray and Jack and waited. Other witnesses came to sit with them, cadets from West Point, veterans from the Marcus Lee Memorial Clinic. Even Mrs. Lee, who had made the trip from San Francisco, sat quietly with her hands folded in prayer. 2 hours later, the judge returned with his decision. Eric Jonathan Lee, please stand. Eric stood, flanked by his attorneys, his face showing resignation and exhaustion. This court finds you guilty of kidnapping, unlawful possession of explosives, and assault. These are serious charges that normally carry significant prison time. The judge paused, and Catherine held her breath. However, the court also finds that your actions were substantially influenced by untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, that you served your country honorably before this incident, and that the victims themselves have asked for mercy on your behalf. The judge continued, therefore, this court sentences you to 5 years supervised release with mandatory psychiatric treatment, 2,000 hours of community service, specifically working with veterans suffering from PTSD, and restitution to be determined for the costs incurred during the incident. If you violate any terms of this agreement, you will serve 15 years in federal prison. Do you understand? Eric's voice cracked. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. Some felt justice had been served. Others felt Eric had gotten away with terrorism. But Catherine felt something simpler. Relief. One more person saved. One more brother brought back from the edge. Outside the courthouse, Eric Lee approached Catherine with his attorney and his parents. His wrists were still cuffed, but would be removed once the paperwork processed. Dr. Hayes, he said, and his voice was hoarse with emotion. I don't know why you helped me. After what I did, after I threatened Jack, I don't understand. Catherine looked at this young man who had lost so much and nearly lost himself in the process. Because your brother saved lives by jumping on a grenade. The way I honor him is by making sure you don't waste yours. You've got a second chance, Eric. Use it. Make Marcus proud. Mrs. Lee stepped forward and took Catherine's hands. You give us our son back. Thank you. Thank you. Catherine embraced the older woman again, and over her shoulder she saw Ray watching with something that might have been approval, or might have been understanding, or might have been the beginning of his own healing. That night, back in Denver, Catherine sat in her apartment and looked at the photograph Mr. Lee had given her. Marcus Lee's grinning face, Jake Stevens' easy smile, David Chen's quiet confidence, and her own younger self, not yet weighted by the choice she would make, not yet hardened by 20 years of guilt. She had not saved them, could not save them, but maybe, just maybe, she had saved their legacy from being poisoned by rage and recrimination. Maybe she had turned Eric Lee's near tragedy into a chance for redemption. Her phone buzzed, a text from Ray. The clinic is renaming its PTSD wing, the Vincent Hartwell Veterans Mental Health Center. Thought you should know. Catherine smiled. The old colonel would have hated having something named after him, but would have grudgingly accepted it if it meant helping more veterans. Another text came through, this one from Jack. Mom, I've been thinking. When I graduate from West Point, I want to go to medical school after my service commitment. I want to help veterans like you. Is that okay? Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears this time. Tears of pride rather than grief. More than okay, she texted back. It's perfect. She set down her phone and looked again at the photograph. And for the first time in 20 years, she let herself remember the good things about Fallujah. The brotherhood, the shared purpose, the moments of humanity in the midst of horror, the way Marcus Lee could make everyone laugh even during the worst firefights, the way Jake Stevens had taught her to play poker with MRE crackers as chips, the way David Chen had talked about his baby daughter and promised to take her fishing when he got home. They had been warriors. They had been her family. They had died doing what warriors do, protecting their brothers. And she had survived to tell their story, to carry their memory, to make sure that their deaths meant something beyond just names on casualty lists and withdrawn medals and 20 years of grief. It was not redemption, not forgiveness, not absolution. But it was a start, and sometimes a start was all you could hope for. 6 months after the sentencing hearing, Catherine Hayes stood in her office at Denver V Hospital and looked at the wall that had slowly transformed from blank white paint into a memorial of its own making. Photographs covered nearly every inch of available space. Marcus Lee in his dress blues, Jake Stevens with his fiancée, both of them impossibly young and smiling. David Chen holding his newborn daughter in a photo his widow had sent Catherine after finding her through the Veterans Network. Colonel Vincent Hartwell from the Gulf War, then at Quantico, then in his final days at West Point, surrounded by the students he had trained to be warriors and hoped would become peacemakers. And new photographs too. Eric Lee on his first day working at the Marcus Lee Memorial Clinic, wearing volunteer credentials and looking uncertain but determined. Raymond Blackwood cutting the ribbon at the Vincent Hartwell Veterans Mental Health Center wing, surrounded by veterans whose lives had been saved by the programs housed there. Jack Morrison in his West Point uniform, receiving an award for courage, the citation carefully worded to honor his actions during the hostage crisis without glorifying the violence that precipitated it. Catherine had spent her entire adult life running from the past, and now the past covered her walls in 4x6 glossy prints, watching her work, bearing witness to every surgery and every saved life and every small act of redemption that could never quite balance the equation, but had to be attempted anyway. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Rocky Mountain Veterans Shooting Foundation. She had not been back to Colorado since Colonel Hartwell's death, had not touched a rifle except to clean and store the Remington he had left her in his will. The foundation's director, Sergeant Major Thomas Chen, a Gulf War veteran who had witnessed the confrontation between her and Ray, wanted to talk about something important enough to call rather than email. Dr. Hayes, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Never a bad time for you, Sergeant Major. What can I do for you? Chen's voice carried the weight of careful consideration, as if he had rehearsed this conversation multiple times before making the call. We're planning something for Veterans Day this year, an expansion of the memorial. We want to dedicate a new section to the fallen from Operation Phantom Fury Fallujah, specifically to the Marines from 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines who died during that operation. Catherine's throat tightened. That's a good thing. Those men deserve to be remembered. We want you to speak at the dedication, you and Raymond Blackwood, together, to tell the real story of what happened that day, not the sanitized version, not the political version, the human version. Sergeant Major, I'm not sure that's a good idea. There are families involved, people who might not want to hear the complicated truth. Dr. Hayes, I was in Kuwait during Desert Storm. I've spent 34 years living with the complicated truth of that war. And I can tell you from experience that families deserve honesty more than they deserve comfortable lies. These Marines died doing their duty. Their families should know what that duty cost, not just in blood, but in the souls of the people who survived. Catherine looked at the photographs on her wall. Marcus Lee's mother had given her another picture. This one of Marcus as a child, maybe 8 years old, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while holding a trophy from some school competition. Mrs. Lee had written on the back, "This is how I remember him. Always winning, always smiling, always my boy." When is the dedication? Catherine asked. November 10th, 21 years since Fallujah. We thought it was time to stop running from that date and start honoring it. 21 years. A whole generation had grown up since that November day when Catherine Morrison had chosen duty over brotherhood and spent 2 decades wondering if she had chosen wrong. Now Sergeant Major Chen was asking her to stand in front of that choice and defend it, explain it, or maybe just acknowledge it for what it was. An impossible decision made by a young Marine who had done her best in circumstances that permitted no good options. "I'll do it," Catherine said, "on one condition. Eric Lee speaks too. He's part of this story now. He deserves to be part of how we tell it." Chen was quiet for a moment. The board might have concerns about that, given his criminal record. "Then tell the board that if they want me, they get Eric too. He spent 6 months working at the clinic, helping other veterans navigate their trauma. He's earned the right to speak about his brother." "I'll make it happen," Chen promised. "See you in November, Dr. Hayes." Catherine ended the call and sat in the silence of her office. surrounded by ghosts and photographs in the accumulated weight of 21 years. She thought about what she would say at the dedication, how she would explain the unexplainable, how she would stand in front of Marines and their families and own the choice she had made without either defending it or apologizing for it, because it existed beyond such simple categorizations. The door opened and Dr. Michael Brennan entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had news he was not entirely sure how to deliver. "You're here late," he said, handing her one of the cups. "I could say the same about you." Brennan settled into the chair across from her desk. "I've been going through the annual statistics for the clinic, the Marcus Lee Wing, the Hartwell Mental Health Center, all of it. And we've treated 473 veterans this year. PTSD, traumatic brain injury, substance abuse, homelessness, suicidal ideation, the whole spectrum of combat aftermath. Of those 473, we've had a 91% success rate in stabilizing acute crises and getting people into long-term care." Catherine did the math in her head. That's 431 lives, give or take. But here's the thing that got me thinking. Brennan leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "When you started here 3 years ago, you told me you were trying to balance an equation. 3 lives lost for 47 lives saved. You've been keeping score in your head ever since, haven't you?" Catherine did not deny it. "Old habits." "Well, stop, because by my count, you passed that ratio about 2 years ago. You've saved more lives as a surgeon than you ever took as a sniper, and you've probably saved more lives through this clinic than most people save in 10 lifetimes. At what point do you let yourself off the hook?" "When it stops hurting," Catherine said quietly. "When I can think about Jake and Marcus and David without feeling like I'm responsible for their deaths. When I can look at their families without wanting to apologize for still being alive." That might never happen. Survivor's guilt doesn't operate on logic. But Catherine, you have to at least try to forgive yourself. Because watching you punish yourself for 21 years is getting exhausting for those of us who care about you. Catherine smiled despite the heaviness in her chest. "When did you become my therapist?" "The day I hired you and realized you were running from something. I figured eventually you'd either outrun it or turn around and face it. Looks like you're finally turning around." They sat in companionable silence, drinking coffee and watching the sunset over Denver through the office window. The city sprawled below them, full of veterans living their own complicated relationships with the wars they had survived, and Catherine thought about the infinite ways that trauma manifested and the equally infinite ways that healing could begin if people were just given the chance and the support and the grace to try. The months between that conversation and Veterans Day passed with the kind of accelerating momentum that comes when you stop resisting the current and let it carry you toward whatever destination it has planned. Catherine threw herself into preparing for the dedication speech, interviewing other Fallujah veterans, reading after-action reports she had avoided for 20 years, forcing herself to confront the totality of that day rather than just the parts that haunted her. She learned that Captain Bryce Morrison, the officer who had ordered her to maintain position, had left the Marine Corps 2 years after Fallujah and become a high school history teacher in rural Montana. She called him, expecting resistance or defensiveness, and instead found a man who had spent 20 years teaching teenagers about the fog of war and impossible choices specifically because he had lived through them. "Staff Sergeant Morrison," he said, using her old rank because in his mind, she would always be the young sniper he had commanded. "I've thought about that day more times than I can count. I've second-guessed every decision I made, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. I gave you an order that put you in an impossible position. I'm sorry for that. Sir, you were doing your job. The convoy was critical. The convoy was important. Your team was critical, and I forced you to choose. That's on me, not you. I just wanted you to know that before this dedication happens and people start picking sides again." Catherine thanked him and ended the call, feeling something she had not expected, absolution from the one person whose judgment she had feared most. Captain Morrison had carried his own guilt, had made his own peace with it, and was offering her permission to do the same. She met with Raymond Blackwood 3 times to coordinate their speeches for the dedication. Ray had changed in the months since the sentencing hearing, had softened in ways that suggested therapy was actually working. He talked about his ex-wife and kids, about the slow process of rebuilding those relationships, about learning to be present instead of haunted. My therapist says I used anger as armor, Ray told her during one of their meetings. As long as I was mad at you, I didn't have to deal with my own stuff. Losing my leg, losing my brothers, losing 20 years of my life to bitterness. You were just convenient to blame. I was also partially responsible, Catherine said. Let's not revise history too much. No, but let's also not keep pretending this was simple. War is complicated. Command is complicated. What happened in Fallujah was tragic, but it wasn't anyone's fault. It was just the cost of doing terrible things in terrible places for reasons that seem less clear with every year that passes. They worked on their speeches separately, but shared them with each other for feedback. Ray's focused on forgiveness and the cost of holding grudges. Catherine's focused on impossible choices and the burden of command. Together, they told a story that was neither heroic nor condemning, but simply human in all its messy, painful complexity. Eric Lee joined them for the final planning session. He had changed too, had found purpose in working at the clinic, had channeled his grief into helping other veterans navigate theirs. He spoke about his brother with pride now instead of rage, had made peace with the fact that Marcus's death had meaning even if the Navy Cross had been withdrawn. I'm going to talk about what it's like to be left behind, Eric said, to be the family member who has to live with the hole that never gets filled, but also about how you can honor that absence without letting it destroy you. Marcus wouldn't want me to waste my life being angry. Took me 33 years to figure that out, but better late than never. Catherine looked at these two men, Ray and Eric, both of them casualties of Fallujah in different ways, both of them finally finding paths toward healing, and she felt something shift inside herself. Maybe redemption was not about balancing equations or saving enough lives to offset the ones lost. Maybe it was simply about being present, being honest, and helping other people do the same. November 10th arrived cold and clear, the Rocky Mountains wearing their first snow of the season like dress whites for a formal ceremony. Catherine drove to the shooting foundation with Jack, who had taken leave from West Point to attend. They talked about his classes, about his plans after graduation, about the medical school applications he was already preparing even though he had 3 more years of military service ahead of him. Mom, can I ask you something? Jack said as they pulled into the foundation's parking lot. Always. Do you regret it? Becoming a sniper, going to war, all of it? Catherine thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. I regret that we were in a war that probably shouldn't have been fought the way we fought it. I regret that good people died for objectives that seem less important now than they did then. But do I regret serving? No. I learned things about myself in combat that I never would have learned otherwise. About courage and fear and what I'm capable of when everything is on the line. Even knowing how it turned out, even knowing about Fallujah, even knowing all of that. Because Fallujah also taught me something important. That you can make the best decision you know how to make and still have it turn out terribly. That's not failure. That's just life. And the real measure of character is what you do after. How you carry it, whether you let it destroy you or whether you find a way to make meaning from it. Jack nodded slowly, processing. I think I understand. I think that's why I want to be a doctor. Not to run from being a soldier, but to add something to it. To be both things. Your father would be proud of that. So would your grandfather. They walked toward the memorial together, and Catherine saw the changes that had been made since her last visit. The new section dedicated to Fallujah Marines was beautifully done. A granite wall with names etched in stone and a bronze statue of a Marine in combat gear, head bowed, rifle reversed in the traditional posture of mourning. 3 names were larger than the others, positioned at eye level. Corporal Jake Stevens, PFC, Marcus Lee, Lance Corporal David Chen. Below their names was an inscription that Catherine had helped write. They died as Marines. They live in memory. They are honored in service to those who remain. Raymond Blackwood was already there, greeting other Fallujah veterans who had made the trip. Sergeant Major Chen was coordinating logistics with the Foundation staff. Eric Lee stood alone near the memorial wall, his hand touching his brother's name, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been conversation with the dead. The dedication began at 1100 hours, the traditional time for military remembrance. Nearly 300 people had gathered, including families of the fallen, veterans from multiple wars, and media covering what had become a surprisingly high-profile event. The story of Catherine and Ray's reconciliation had resonated with people, had become a narrative about healing and forgiveness that transcended the specific details of Fallujah. Sergeant Major Chen spoke first, welcoming everyone and explaining the purpose of the memorial. Then came the formal remarks from a Marine Corps general, words about honor and sacrifice, and the proud tradition of the Corps. The general spoke well but abstractly, using the language of official recognition that felt true but incomplete. Then Raymond Blackwood took the podium. He stood there for a moment in silence. A man in his mid-40s who looked older because of what he had carried and younger because of what he had finally put down. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong and human. 21 years ago, I lost my leg in Fallujah. I also lost two brothers, Jake Stevens and Marcus Lee. For 20 years after that, I lost something else, my ability to forgive. I blame Staff Sergeant Catherine Morrison for the choice she made that day, for following orders instead of helping us, for valuing the lives of strangers over the lives of her team. I hated her with everything I had, and that hatred poisoned every aspect of my life, my marriage, my relationship with my kids, my own mental health. I became a bitter, angry man who thought that if I could just make Catherine hurt the way I hurt, somehow it would make things better. Ray paused and Catherine saw tears on his face. I was wrong. Catherine Morrison made an impossible choice in combat, and she spent 21 years trying to atone for it. She became a doctor. She saves lives every day. She built a clinic named after Marcus Lee that has helped hundreds of veterans. She fought for my forgiveness when she didn't deserve my hatred. And slowly, painfully, she helped me understand that the enemy was never her. The enemy was war itself and the way it forces good people into impossible situations. He looked directly at Catherine. Jake and Marcus didn't die because of you. They died because they were Marines doing their duty in a war zone. You also did your duty, and you've lived with the guilt of that ever since. But I'm here today to tell you in front of everyone that I forgive you. Not because you need my forgiveness, but because I need to give it. I need to let go of that anger so I can finally heal, so we can both heal. The crowd was silent except for the sound of people crying. Catherine felt Jack's hand squeeze hers. Eric Lee spoke next, and his speech was shorter but no less powerful. He talked about growing up in his brother's shadow, about the burden of being left behind, about the 20 years he spent angry at a system that had taken Marcus and then forgotten him. He talked about his own service, his own losses, his own mistakes that had led to a federal courtroom, and a second chance he had not deserved but had been given anyway. My brother Marcus died a hero, Eric said, his voice steady despite the emotion. But the Marine Corps pulled his Navy Cross because of politics and paperwork and all the complicated bureaucracy that happens after battles are fought. For 20 years that felt like erasure, like Marcus had died for nothing. But then I met Dr. Catherine Hayes, and she showed me that Marcus's legacy wasn't a medal. It was the lives he saved by jumping on that grenade. It was the clinic that bears his name. It was the way people still remember him as a Marine who chose sacrifice over survival. Eric turned to look at his parents who sat in the front row holding hands and crying. Mom, Dad, Marcus didn't die in vain. He died the way he lived, protecting his brothers. And now his name will live on in this memorial, in the clinic, in the hearts of everyone who knew him. That's worth more than any medal. Then it was Catherine's turn. She walked to the podium and looked out at 300 faces, some familiar and some strange, all of them waiting to hear what she would say about the day that had defined her adult life. She had prepared a speech, had practiced it dozens of times, but standing there looking at Marcus Lee's parents and Jake Stevens' elderly mother, and the widow of David Chen holding her daughter who was now 21 and looked heartbreakingly like her father, Catherine set aside her notes and spoke from a place deeper than preparation. 21 years ago, I was a 22-year-old Marine sniper on a rooftop in Fallujah. I had been in combat for 6 months. I had killed 27 people that I knew about, probably more that I didn't. I thought I understood war. I thought I knew what I was doing. I was wrong. She took a breath, steadying herself. On November 10th, 2004, I received an order from my commanding officer to maintain my position and cover a convoy that was under heavy fire. At the same time, my team in the building below me was being overrun by insurgents. I had to choose, follow orders and save 47 Marines in the convoy, or disobey orders and try to save 3 Marines in my building. I chose the convoy. I followed my training, my orders, my understanding of mission priorities. And while I was following those orders, Jake Stevens, Marcus Lee, and David Chen died. Catherine's voice cracked, but she continued. For 21 years, I've asked myself if I made the right choice. And the answer is, I don't know. I will never know because there was no right choice. There was only my choice, made in 8 seconds of absolute terror and clarity and responsibility. I saved 47 people. I failed to save 3. Those are the facts. Everything else is interpretation. She looked at the memorial wall, at the names etched in stone. But here's what I do know. Jake and Marcus and David were warriors. They understood duty. They understood sacrifice. And I have to believe, that they would have made the same choice I made if our positions had been reversed. Not because it was easy or right or comfortable, but because it was what warriors do. We make impossible choices and then we live with them. Catherine turned back to the crowd. I became a doctor because I couldn't be a sniper anymore. Every life I save is an attempt to balance the equation, to make the 3 I lost matter by saving hundreds more. But I've learned something through all of this. You can't balance that equation. You can't trade lives like currency and expect it to add up to peace. All you can do is honor the dead by living well, by helping others, by making sure their sacrifice meant something, even if we can't always articulate what that meaning is. She paused, gathering herself for the final words. To the families of the fallen, I'm sorry. I'm sorry your sons and brothers and fathers died in Fallujah. I'm sorry I couldn't save them. I'm sorry that 21 years later, we're still trying to make sense of losses that will never make sense. But I promise you this, I will never forget them. I will never stop honoring them. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the sacrifice they made. Catherine stepped away from the podium and walked to the memorial wall. She placed her hand on Marcus Lee's name, then Jake Stevens, then David Chen's, and she whispered words that only they could hear, words of apology and love, and the kind of grief that time softens but never erases. The ceremony concluded with a 21-gun salute and taps played by a lone bugler, the notes carrying across the mountain valley and fading into the thin November air. People began to disperse, some heading to the lodge for the reception, others lingering at the memorial wall to find names and remember. Mrs. Lee approached Catherine, her small frame wrapped in a black coat, her face showing every one of her 70 years, but also a piece that had not been there 6 months ago. Dr. Hayes, thank you for everything you said, for everything you do, for giving my son back to me by remembering him. Catherine embraced her, this woman who had lost more than anyone should have to lose, and they held each other in the shared understanding of grief and survival. Jake Stevens' mother came next, moving slowly with the aid of a cane, her eyes sharp despite her 83 years. My Jake always spoke highly of you, Staff Sergeant. In his letters home, he said you were the best shot he'd ever seen and the best leader he'd ever served under. He wouldn't blame you for what happened, and neither do I. One by one, the families came to Catherine, some to forgive, some to simply acknowledge, some to say that they had spent 21 years not knowing what to feel, and that hearing the truth, the complicated, messy truth, had finally given them permission to grieve without needing someone to blame. Ray found her later, after the families had gone and the crowd had thinned and the mountain shadows had grown long with approaching evening. You did good, Staff Sergeant, he said, using the old rank with affection, now instead of bitterness. So did you, Corporal. They stood together, looking at the memorial wall, and Catherine thought about all the walls she had built in her life to keep the past contained. This wall was different. This wall was meant to remember, not to hide. To honor, not to forget. What do you think they would say? Ray asked. Jake and Marcus and David, if they could see all this, the memorial, the clinic, Eric getting a second chance, us finally making peace with each other. Catherine thought about it for a long moment. I think they'd say we took too damn long, but I think they'd also say they were proud of us for getting here eventually. Yeah, Ray agreed. That sounds about right. The sun set over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Catherine of muzzle flashes and tracer rounds and all the terrible beauty of war. But it also reminded her of sunrise, of new beginnings, of the way light always returns, no matter how dark the night. 6 months after the dedication, Catherine Hayes stood in her office at Denver VA Hospital for the last time. She was not leaving medicine, but she was leaving administration. She had accepted a position teaching trauma surgery at the University of Colorado Medical School, where she would spend half her time in the classroom and half her time in the operating room, training the next generation of doctors who would save the next generation of warriors who would come home broken from the next generation of wars. Eric Lee would take over as director of the Marcus Lee Memorial Clinic. He had completed his community service requirement and had proven himself not just competent, but exceptional at helping veterans navigate their trauma. The board had voted unanimously to offer him the position, and he had accepted with tears in his eyes and a promise to honor his brother's memory through service. Raymond Blackwood had been hired as the clinical director of the Vincent Hartwell Veterans Mental Health Center, bringing his experience as both patient and survivor to the work of helping other veterans find their way through the darkness of combat aftermath. The equation was still unbalanced. 3 lives lost could never be offset by any number of lives saved. But Catherine had finally learned that balance was not the point. The point was to keep trying, keep serving, keep honoring the fallen by living well and helping others do the same. Her phone rang. Jack calling from West Point. Mom, I got my medical school acceptance, Johns Hopkins. They're holding a spot for me after I complete my service obligation. Catherine felt pride and love and a bittersweet recognition that her son was following in her footsteps while hopefully avoiding her mistakes. That's wonderful, Jack. Your father would be so proud. I know, I feel him sometimes, like he's watching, making sure I don't screw up too badly. He's watching. So is your grandfather. So are Jake and Marcus and all the others who didn't get the chance to see what comes next. We carry them with us, not as burdens, but as witnesses. They want us to live well. After the call ended, Catherine packed the last of her personal items from the office. The photographs came down from the walls, carefully wrapped and boxed. But she left one photograph hanging, a gift to whoever occupied this office next. It showed Marcus Lee and Jake Stevens and David Chen, young and smiling and alive, standing in front of a Humvee in Fallujah with their whole futures ahead of them, and no idea that those futures would be measured in days instead of decades. On the back of the photo, Catherine wrote a message for the next person who would sit in this chair and carry the weight of trying to save people who had been broken by service to their country. These Marines died in Fallujah on November 10, 2004. They were warriors. They were heroes. They were my brothers. I couldn't save them then, but I've spent 21 years trying to save others in their names. Now it's your turn. Don't carry them as guilt. Carry them as inspiration. They deserve that much. So do you. Catherine walked out of the office, out of the hospital, into a Colorado evening that smelled like snow and possibility. She drove not home, but to Rocky Mountain Veterans Shooting Foundation, 2 hours through the mountains to the place where her reckoning had begun and, she hoped, where her healing could finally complete itself. The range was empty when she arrived, closed for the evening, but Sergeant Major Chen had given her a key and permission to use the facilities whenever she wanted. She walked to the 1,000-yard range and set up a single target downrange, a simple bullseye on clean white paper. Then she assembled Colonel Hartwell's Remington, the rifle he had left her in his will, the rifle she had not fired since the day she could not shoot through the photographs of the fallen. Catherine settled into a prone position behind the rifle, and for the first time in 21 years, she allowed herself to simply shoot without the weight of guilt or the burden of redemption. She shot for the pleasure of it, for the precision of it, for the skill that had been trained into her hands by a colonel who had understood that being a warrior was not about killing but about discipline and focus and the ability to remain calm when everything was chaos. She fired 10 rounds and all 10 were 10s, perfect shots that clustered in the center of the target like a flower blooming 1,000 yards away. And then she fired one more round, one final shot, and she fired it deliberately high, over the target, into the mountain behind it where the bullet would bury itself in dirt and stone and become part of the landscape. A shot not taken. A shot that harmed no one. A shot that represented all the times she had chosen not to shoot. All the restraint and discipline and control that Colonel Hartwell had taught her was more important than accuracy. The greatest shot a marksman can take is the one they choose not to fire. Catherine cleared her rifle and stood. The sun had set completely now, leaving the range in darkness except for the distant lights of the lodge. She walked back to her car carrying the Remington, and she realized that this was the first time since Fallujah that she had held a rifle and felt at peace. Not redeemed, not forgiven, not free from the past, but no longer imprisoned by it either. She drove home through the mountain darkness, And she thought about Jake and Marcus and David, and instead of grief, she felt gratitude. Gratitude for having known them. Gratitude for having served with them. Gratitude for the complicated gift of survival that allowed her to tell their stories and honor their memories and make sure that their deaths meant something beyond just names on a casualty list. The next morning, Catherine woke early and went for a run through the Denver streets as the sun rose over the eastern plains. She ran past the hospital where she had saved hundreds of lives, past the clinic that bore Marcus Lee's name, past the memorial park where David Morrison's name was etched among the local fallen. She ran not away from anything but towards something, toward a future where the past was acknowledged but not determinative, where grief was honored but not overwhelming, where the weight of impossible choices was carried but not crushing. And when she finished her run and stood breathing hard in the morning light, Catherine Hayes allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in 21 years. Peace, not the peace of forgetting, not the peace of absolution, but the peace of acceptance, of having done the best she could with what she knew at the time, of having spent 2 decades trying to make meaning from tragedy, of having finally learned that some equations cannot be balanced but must be lived with anyway. She thought of Colonel Hartwell's last words. They lived, had families, worth it. The 47 Marines from the convoy had grown up, had families, had lives that continued because Catherine Morrison had stayed at her post and followed her orders and made a choice that cost 3 lives to save 47. Was it worth it? She would never know, could never know, would spend the rest of her life not knowing. But she could live with that uncertainty now, could carry it without being crushed by it, could honor the fallen without being destroyed by their absence. And that finally was enough. Catherine walked home through streets filling with morning commuters, people heading to jobs and lives and their own complicated relationships with choice and consequence, and the burden of living in a world where nothing is simple and everything matters. She walked past a bus stop where a young Marine in dress blues waited, probably heading to a recruiter's office or a ceremony or one of the 1,000 small duties that fill a military life. He saw Catherine's VA hospital ID badge and nodded respectfully. "Morning, ma'am." "Morning, Marine. Stay safe out there." "Always, ma'am. Semper Fi." "Semper Fidelis," Catherine replied, and the words felt different now. Always faithful, not just to the Corps or to the mission or to the orders, but to the memory of those who fell and to the obligation of those who survived to live well and serve honorably and make sure that the sacrifice meant something. She continued home and she thought about the last shot, the one she had fired deliberately high into the mountain, the shot that harmed nothing and proved nothing, except that she still had the control to choose where her bullets went. The greatest shot is the one you choose not to fire. But sometimes, Catherine thought, the greatest shot is the one you fire into the sky, releasing the bullet and the burden and the weight of 21 years, letting it all go into the mountain air where it can finally rest. She had made her peace with Fallujah, not by forgetting it, not by forgiving herself, but by accepting that she had done her best in an impossible situation, that her best had not been perfect, and that living with imperfection was the human condition that warriors and civilians shared equally. The sun climbed higher. The city woke fully. And Catherine Hayes, former Marine Scout sniper, surgeon, survivor, walked into her apartment and closed the door on the past and opened a window on whatever came next. Because the mission was not over. Would never be over. There would always be more veterans to help, more lives to save, more impossible choices to navigate. But now she would face them not as penance but as purpose, not as guilt but as grace, not as a warrior seeking redemption, but as a healer who had learned that the greatest battle is not against an enemy, but against the darkness inside ourselves, and that winning that battle does not mean destroying the darkness, but learning to carry light despite it. Catherine sat in her quiet apartment and looked at the photograph of Marcus and Jake and David one more time. Their young faces, their confident smiles, their absolute certainty that they would come home. "Thank you," she whispered to them, "for your service, for your sacrifice, for teaching me what it means to be a Marine even 21 years after I stopped wearing the uniform. I'll carry you with honor. I'll live with purpose, and I'll make sure your names are never forgotten." Then she placed the photograph in a frame on her mantle, not hidden away but displayed proudly, and she went to make breakfast and plan her first lecture for the medical students who would learn from her how to save lives while carrying the weight of the lives they could not save. The war was over. The battle was won. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly and with honor and with the complicated grace of survival. And that finally was enough. The end. As the storyteller behind this journey, I want to ask you something. If you were Catherine on that Fallujah rooftop, what would you have chosen? 47 strangers or 3 brothers? There's no right answer, and that's exactly why this story matters. To every veteran watching, your impossible choices, your silent battles, your 20-year journeys home, they deserve to be told. Drop a comment sharing what hit hardest for you. Your story might help another veteran finally understand they're not alone. Hit subscribe if you believe some stories are worth 3 hours of your time. Next week, a World War II medic's secret that changed everything.